Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Quiet down back there, I yelled whilst driving down an all too familiar road. My best friend and his girlfriend wouldn't stop laughing loudly with each other, much like young couples do. I almost regretted bringing them, but I really didn't want to go alone, and inviting one of those two lovebirds meant inviting the pair. They were a package deal. Lucky for me, the tortuous sound of laughter would soon cease as we were approaching our destination. "We're here," I stated, less to point out our arrival and more to shut the two of them up. I just wanted some peace and quiet so I could think clearly. I wasn't exactly mentally prepared for what needed to be done. My aunt's old house was just as I remembered it. A rickety old cottage down a dead-end road in the middle of nowhere, complete with woods, wildlife, and the welcoming smell of roses that she often planted near the stone walkway. That was when it finally hit me. While traversing that very walkway, smelling those very roses, I stopped dead in my tracks, tears welling up in my eyes. "Are you okay?" my friend's girlfriend asked. "Yes, I'm fine. I just need a second." They looked concerned, but ununderstood. What else would they expect of me, coming back to my aunt's house right after she died? Honestly, it felt a little weird. I may have been her favorite nephew, but after leaving me everything in her will, it seemed wrong to go out there so soon. The service was held just a day prior. I knew everything she had wasn't much, and I knew I wasn't really there to collect my inheritance, but I still felt bad. And at this moment, I felt even worse. The memories I had of her were being dredged up with every step I took toward the front door. I hadn't seen her since I was 10 years old, but I could play every memory in my head like a movie. I was very close to her in those days. She might as well have been my mom. My actual mother cared for me, but she wasn't loving in the way that my aunt was. I remember visiting her after school and being greeted with some cliché milk and cookies. Instead of watching television like a normal kid, she didn't own one, I would listen to my aunt play piano for hours on end. We would sometimes go bird watching or work in the garden, things that I have not done or even thought of doing since. These are some of my most treasured memories, and, like treasure, I kept them locked up and hidden away for many years, until now. As I approached the door to the cottage, I stopped in my tracks once more. "Seriously, are you okay?" my friend asked this time, seeming very concerned. He'd never seen me like this before. "I'm fine. Why don't you two take that hike you were talking about? I'll go on in and take a look around. You guys can meet me back at the car later." "If you say so." The two of them took off down a trail in the woods, and I was left standing there, looking at the house that I'd not seen in many years. The feeling that overcame me was so strange, it's hard to put into words. It was more than grief, greater than sadness. I guess the best way to say it is that I missed her. It's funny. If she could see me now, she probably wouldn't recognize me. I'm tall, bearded, and wear glasses, almost the polar opposite of my appearance as a child. Thinking of this just made me sadder. She would never get to see the man I had become. With one last sigh of emotion, I marched on and reached for the handle on the front door. My aunt didn't have locks on her doors or windows. The house was constructed so long ago that it wasn't even built with them. She could have had some installed, but she didn't feel she needed them out in the middle of nowhere. She brought it up one of the first times I stayed there, saying, "Trust the world and it will set you free." When I was a kid, hearing her say this made me feel safe somehow. Being fully grown and recalling this statement now, I find it very peculiar. But then again, that was my aunt for you, unpretentious and oblivious to the rest of the world around her. Honestly, I miss that part of her most. All of those memories come back to me piece by piece as I pulled the door open. The bittersweet release I felt was interrupted when I saw the inside of the cottage. Everything, and I mean everything, was exactly in its place. It was like I was a kid again, coming over after school to enjoy my aunt's company. My memories were projected right in front of me like a nostalgic outburst of energy. I could see my aunt sitting at the piano, playing as she often would. I could see me sitting there, eating some homemade cookies, listening intently to the music. I could see her again, cooking dinner in the kitchen, as I sat on the couch reading one of her old books. I walked past these living recollections and went upstairs to see more. I stopped quickly when I reached the top of the staircase. I realized that it only led to the attic. I still had no interest in it, remembering that my aunt used it for storage, so I traveled back downstairs. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Maybe just a little peace of mind to put my heart at ease. Maybe just something that would let me know without a doubt that my aunt passed away peacefully. In truth, I felt an immense amount of guilt being in that house again. Almost too much to bear. When I was just shy of 11 years old, my parents moved out of state. This is when I stopped seeing my aunt. We kind of lost touch, especially seeing as she didn't have any real means of communications out there. No phone, no computer. She didn't even have a mailbox, and the nearest post office was over 20 miles away. Being older now, I could have easily paid her a visit, and I am sure she would have loved to have seen me. I guess I just thought she would always be there. Unfortunately, she had a heart attack, and with no hospital or neighbors for miles, death came knocking on her unlocked door in a hasty fashion. At the very least, this visit had put the fleeting quality of life into perspective for me. At this point, I figured it was the only thing that I would end up taking away from the place. As I made my way down the stairs and back into the living room, I noticed something. I was in such a hurry to escape my corporeal memories that I didn't notice it before. It was the desk. The desk where my aunt would sit and write for hours at a time. She said that it helped her experience the world outside of her cottage by writing about how she imagined and wanted it to be. The more I remembered my aunt, the more I could see how isolated and somewhat unstable she really was. She was odd, but I loved her just the same, even now. What I hadn't noticed upon entering the house was that the desk drawer was open. I looked inside and found a single sheet of paper with my aunt's handwriting on it. And this is what it said. To my dearest nephew, if you are reading this, then the cold tides of death have swept me away once and for all. I know that we have not seen each other since you were a child, but I hope you still think fondly back on our time together. I was happy to look after you, and I know that you were very happy to spend time with me. I don't want you to be sad or feel off-put about my death in any way. This is how it is, and in turn how it was meant to be. I will always hold you dear in my heart, and I hope you'll do the same for me. I want you to live freely despite this, and enjoy each and every moment of your life just as I did mine. I will see you again someday, and I look forward to it. Trust the world, and it will set you free. I shed a single tear reading this passage, knowing that my aunt wanted me to find peace in this old house. The very closure I was looking for was in her desk the whole time. The elation I felt almost distracted me from the postscript at the bottom of the page. P.S. Don't go in the basement. How peculiar. What was down there? Was my aunt hiding something? If so, what was it? Curious as ever, I walked over to the basement door with the letter in hand, knowing that the answers were down there. I took one last look at the warning. Don't go in the basement. It was most likely the ramblings of an unstable woman on the verge of death, but what could be the real meaning behind it? Why the basement? Why me? I could recall the basement from when I was younger, but I didn't remember much. I'd only been down there once. My aunt was outside gardening while I was inside reading one of her books. I grew tired of reading and set the book down on her desk. Soon after, I began wandering around the house out of boredom. I walked around the entire cottage rather quickly. Eventually, I came upon the basement, somewhere I had never played before. Knowing my aunt wouldn't be in for a while, I decided to venture on. I turned the knob and swung the door open. I could only see the top of the stairs descending down into darkness. Despite the bit of fear rattling in my chest, I pressed on. Once down there, my field of vision was filled with pitch blackness. This caused me to scramble about, looking for a light switch. After a few moments, I bumped into a string dangling from the ceiling in the middle of the room. Upon pulling it, the room lit up, however dimly, and what I saw disappointed me. It was a typical basement, but smaller, with concrete walls, a concrete floor, and some pieces of wood sitting off in the corner. Probably some old floorboards left over from the house's construction. When you're a kid, there's a little bit of mystery and adventure injected into everything you do. This adventure ended on a flat note, leading me to an unused space lost to the depths of the house. The next thing I remember was my aunt's voice as she came down the stairs yelling, "You can't be down here!" She sounded more worried than angry, probably scared I would somehow hurt myself down there. There was more to this memory, but that was all I could recall while standing in front of the basement door. I turned the knob and swung the door open, revealing only the top of the stairs in the basement below, completely void of light. Instead of feeling adventurous like I did as a child, I now felt nervous, repeating the words my aunt had left for me over and over in my head, and then asking myself once more, why? I crept down the stairs slowly, so as not to shake the foundation. That's what I told myself, but I guess my sluggish pace was largely on account of the fact that I was frightened at what I might find when I reached the bottom. Growing impatient and uncomfortably anxious, I picked up the pace a bit. I felt the concrete floor below my feet, and I rapidly darted toward the center of the room, reaching for the light, praying that it still worked. I felt around for the string and then pulled it. To my delight, it still harbored electricity. The room became dimly lit. In a panicky state, I spun around, looking every which way as I did. What I saw surprised me. There was nothing there. It was just how I left it when I was a kid. Even the old floorboards were there, still untouched. I felt relieved, but far more confused than before. Why didn't my aunt want me to go down there? I pondered for a bit and figured that maybe there was asbestos or mold in the cellar walls. This would explain why she didn't want me playing in there as a kid, and why she didn't want me there as an adult either. She just wanted to keep me safe like she always did. This made me feel better, but deep down, I knew there was more behind my aunt's plea. As I made my way over to the stairs, something gave me pause. Memories were coming back to me. I could recall being in the basement when I was younger, but there was something different about it. Different than how it looked now. There was a door. A door that led straight to the attic. How could I have forgotten? It was all so clear to me now. I remember finding a door down there and entering the attic. I knew that it was the attic because I peered out the window and saw my aunt gardening 2 stories below. I waved to her, but she was too busy to notice me. I found it odd at the time that I was able to travel directly from the basement to the attic without so much as climbing a single step. But I brushed it off. After all, I was only 10, and I had no interest in getting caught up in the semantics of how a house was built. Being older, this strange memory was perplexing. How could the basement lead to the attic? It isn't even remotely possible. I tried to call on some more memories, but the details of that day were still fuzzy. I tried convincing myself that it was a dream I was recalling. How could it have been anything else? It was nonsense, right? There's no way it really happened. Somewhat comfortable with this hypothesis, I continued to the stairs, but not before giving the basement another once-over. What I saw eliminated all doubt from my mind. There, in the middle of the far left wall of the basement, was the door from my memory. I squinted and rubbed my eyes, keeping them closed for a good few seconds before opening them again. When I did, the door was still there, as tangible and existent as ever. This couldn't be. It just couldn't. I knew for a fact that the door was not just there a few minutes before, and I had already convinced myself that my childhood memory was nothing more than a bizarre dream. What the hell was going on? There was only one way to find out. After regaining some composure and mustering up a small amount of courage, I walked ever so slowly toward the inexplicable door. My unhurried movements mirrored my hesitant exterior, allowing me to stall for a moment while I gathered some nerve to actually open the damn thing. Despite my slothful motion, I covered the gap in a few seconds, a testament to the basement's small size. The moment of truth was upon me. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. This was it. I would finally get to the bottom of my aunt's plea and my odd memories. The door creaked and revealed the room behind it. Lo and behold, it was none other than the attic, just as I remembered it, window and all. But how? The sunlight came through the window and danced across the room brilliantly, leaving me awestruck. I walked forward to look outside to make sure that this was indeed the attic, and I hadn't gone completely crazy. After peering out the window, that verdict was still up in the air. 2 stories below was my aunt's yard. The grass was green as ever, and the sky was clear as day. Everything was so vibrant. I looked over at my aunt's garden, and to my surprise, there was a person there. It was a woman, and she was gardening. Who was that? And why was she in my aunt's garden? She turned around, revealing her face, and to my surprise, it was my aunt. What? How? My aunt was dead. I watched as she was lowered into the earth. Just then, I heard the sound of footsteps from behind me. Startled, I turned around to face the noise. "Who are you?" a soft voice asked. It was my 10-year-old self, standing just 20 feet away from me. I was in such a delirious state by this point that I decided to just go with it and converse with myself. I'm a friend. That's all I could think of to say. You're a friend of my aunt's? He asked, innocently. I'd forgotten just how curious I was as a child. Yes, a very dear friend. My younger self walked over to look out the window where I was standing. I stepped aside and let him do so. He saw our aunt outside gardening below and waved at her. She didn't notice. Do you have an aunt? He asked. Yes, but she passed away, I said. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Just then, an epiphany struck. Maybe this was the reason I was here. Maybe this was the closure I needed all along. Listen to me. I know it's hard for you to understand right now, but someday your aunt will pass away too. I want you to spend as much time as possible with her and visit her whenever you can. You mean the world to her, and you will regret it if you don't make an effort to be with her now while you still can. Okay, that's all he said. That's all he needed to say. After walking around and looking at some of the old stuff in the attic, including some old books that caught his eye, my younger self left the attic to venture back to the basement and shut the door behind him. I looked out the window and noticed that my aunt had finished gardening and was now walking back to the house. This was when my next epiphany struck. I was beginning to remember more of the events from that day. It was all coming back to me. I remember me, as I look now, standing in the attic, the friendly bearded man with glasses. I remembered the conversation we had, and even discussing it with my aunt afterward. My astonishment was interrupted by more footsteps in the next room. This time they were my aunt's. I ran over to the door and listened. "You can't be down there!" she yelled in a worried tone. I wanted to open the door and confront her, just to see her one last time and to tell her that I'm sorry for never visiting. I reached for the knob, but I thought it best not to go out there. She would probably have thought that I was an intruder lurking around her house. As I said before, she wouldn't recognize me, all grown up. My apology would have to go unspoken. I could hear her scolding the younger version of me and then bringing me back upstairs. And instead of listening to find out what happened next, I just remembered. I could recall telling my aunt about the attic door in the basement and the friendly bearded man. She told me that I had quite the imagination and told me to wash up for dinner. Looking back now, I remembered a troubled glint in her eye, especially after divulging what the bearded man told me. She seemed to know more about my experience than she let on. I stood there for a while, taking everything in. Eventually, I decided it was time for me to leave. I grabbed the knob and jiggled it. It wouldn't budge. I turned it a little harder, but to no avail. A wave of terror consumed me. This didn't make any sense. The doors in my aunt's house had no locks. Then again, nothing made sense up until this point either. I backed up a little bit and ran into the door. It remained still. I did this a few more times and even tried breaking the window. Nothing happened. Feeling weary, I sat down and took a breather. This is when I heard a distant echo of footsteps and voices coming from within the house. It was my friend and his girlfriend. I'd almost forgotten about them. I was saved. In a relieved stupor, I called out to them. It became quickly apparent that they could not hear me from wherever I was. I heard them walking around, calling out my name. I increased my volume and started banging on the door. "I'm in here, guys!" I yelled, not knowing whether I was below or above them. They still couldn't hear me. I began to panic. I started screaming at the top of my lungs and banging as hard as I could on the attic door. I received no response. With a dead voice and pained hands, I gave up. I put my back against the wall and slid down to a sitting position, a few tears streaming down my face. I just sat there and listened as my friend and his girlfriend conversed from within the house. Where could he be? He said he would meet us here at the car, right? If he's not in the house, then where the hell is he? My friend asked his girlfriend. Did you try the basement? She asked. Yes. There's nothing but some old floorboards down there. What about the attic? She asked. I tried there too. It's just filled with a bunch of old dusty antiques. We'll have to call the police and have them look for him too. He must have gotten lost in the woods looking for us. As they made their way out of the cottage, my heart sunk. If they'd already searched the basement and attic, then where was I? I quietly sobbed in the corner for a while before looking through some of my aunt's old things. It was all I could do at this point. I didn't care for any of it, save for one treasure of hers that caught my eye. It was a book with a blood-red symbol hand-painted on the front. I'd never seen anything like it before. I opened it up and read the beginning aloud. The spells in this book are to be followed precisely. If even one step is not executed properly, you might endanger yourself and those around you. Use these spells at your own risk. The odd nature of the preface littered my nerves with a sense of worry. Was my aunt a witch? Before turning the page, I noticed an old lace bookmark saving one of the pages. I opened up to it and looked at the chapter heading. Chapter 8, Horticulture. I glanced over at the next page and saw a spell meant to bring your garden to life. The ritual involved lighting some candles and making a circle of some special sand I've never heard of. From within the circle, you are to recite the spell verbatim. My Latin was a little rusty, but from what I could read of the incantation, it said something along the lines of, "Bring above that which is below," which I assumed referred to the growing of plants. I gathered that my aunt performed the ritual in the attic, as there were some dormant candles in with her stuff. The inclusion of this book in my aunt's collection now made sense to me. She wanted to spice up her dull garden with a bit of witchcraft. I can say with some confidence that it more than likely backfired. I'm now stuck in this damn place, a place that seems to be the realm of its own. I will more than likely spend an eternity here. I'm growing now to accept my fate. She did warn me, after all. I should have listened. This is my fault, and mine alone. With the endless paper and writing materials here in this old attic, I'm left to do nothing but write down in words what has happened to me, in the hopes that someday someone may come across it, somehow. The words of a living ghost. If you are reading this, please listen to what I have to say. Your time here is not boundless, and at any moment the horrid hand of the unknown could come knocking at your door, there to bereave your loved ones and steal you away from your blissful, ordinary existence. The cause of this sudden upheaval will be death, or in my case, something far worse. Last but not least, if you are ever in this neck of the woods and feel a need to stop in and say hi, go right ahead. I can't promise you'll get a response. I just want you to remember two things. Your life is fleeting, so spend your time wiser than I did mine. And whatever you do, don't go into the basement.
Max Hellier was never able to explain exactly what it was that woke him from his normally deep sleep. He could usually sleep through any disturbance. The room was pitch black, and although there was no light of any sort from the window, a faint bluish glimmer permeated the gloom. It was a weird, pulsating reflection of light, unlike any Hellier had ever seen. Then he noticed that the light was surrounding the reflection of the bedroom door in the mirror on the opposite wall. But it was something else that almost made his heart stop beating. For although he could see nobody beside him in the bed, a quick glance to the side showed a definite indentation of the pillow and the outline of a body beneath the blankets. Even worse, there was a sudden, intense coldness beside him, almost as if he were lying beside a corpse. He glanced in the mirror again and stifled a scream of horror. Hellier couldn't see himself reflected in the dark mirror, but there was another man lying there. A burly, bearded, handsome man with a swarthy complexion. And at that instant, Hellier could hear the man's heavy breathing. Then, still in the mirror, he saw the bedroom door open slowly and a woman peer in. Her eyes were fixed on the figure of the bearded man on the bed. Hellier watched as she crept up to the man with a horrible feline stealth and gripped the sleeper's throat with her long, bony fingers. He stared silently at the mirror as she squeezed the last breath of life from the hefty man. Then suddenly, the hideous drama ended. The picture faded. And Hellier was once more alone in the room. Badly shaken by this experience, Hellier wished he had stayed somewhere else. He had disliked the room in the inn in Munich as soon as he saw it, especially the tall mirror that overshadowed the room, reflecting every movement, every tiny disturbance. Hellier, like many people, never slept on the left side of his bed, and now, as he sat shivering in the huge bed staring at the empty mirror, he was grateful for his habit of sleeping on the right. He sank thankfully back into the pillows and tried to blot the dreadful vision of murder from his mind. In the morning, he was not sure that he had either dreamed the incident or else that his tired brain had run riot. He would have left the inn that very day, except that he met an old army buddy walking through Munich. Franz Braun was down on his luck. His heart had always been in painting, but Hellier knew that he had little talent. Braun had no job, no money, and that very morning had been evicted from his lodgings. Hellier offered Braun a meal at the inn and a night's lodging, not only out of friendship. Hellier wanted to see if Braun too would see the strange scene in the mirror. It turned out that now, in 1952, Braun had changed little from his war days. He wined and dined lavishly on Hellier's money and spent the whole evening flirting with the barmaid. Hellier had already gone up to the room when Braun came bustling in. "She had to get back to work," he told Hellier, "so we may as well turn in for the night." Hellier nodded. Braun said, "The girl warned me not to sleep on the left side of the bed. I wonder why." Hellier had not told Braun about the apparitions in the mirror, but Braun was skeptical anyway about supernatural experiences. They settled down to sleep, Braun on the left side of the bed. It was hours later when Hellier woke to find that the room was deadly cold, and in the mirror at the foot of the bed, the bedroom glowed again with that ghostly light. He stared at the reflection. There was no sign of himself or Braun in the mirror, but the form of the heavy, dark-skinned man was once more lying on the left-hand side. Hellier turned to look at the form beside him, but the face on the pillow was that of Franz Braun. Hellier looked back to the mirror, and just as it had on the previous night, the door in the mirror opened slowly. The same gaunt, marble-like face peered in, and with brutish determination, the figure crept towards the bed, its face contorted with malice. The cruel white fingers settled once more on the throat beneath the man's bushy beard. Hellier watched, fascinated, as the woman's hands clasped tighter and tighter. Then, as the shuddering form in the mirror grew still, both figures vanished. Braun had not stirred at all during the drama, but now Hellier turned to his friend and shook him. Braun could not be roused. Alarmed, Hellier snapped on the light, and then he let out a cry of sheer terror. Braun was dead. On his throat were 2 red marks, slowly fading from sight. Hellier's scream roused everybody. The doctor who was called attributed Braun's death to heart failure, but Hellier knew that Braun had been as healthy as a young horse. The next day, he questioned the barmaid, who had warned Braun about sleeping on the left-hand side of the bed. The girl looked at him uncertainly before saying, "I was right to warn him, Herr Hellier. The last few people who slept on the left side of that bed died in exactly the same way."
Mind-numbing white light from simultaneous shell bursts scattered the men, some dead before they hit the ground, others screaming for a medic. The soldier flinched and involuntarily turned his head away, using his hands to shield his eyes. Beneath him, the earth rumbled and shook. More men appeared beside him, running toward the source of the unrelenting volley of enemy bullets. An explosion above them rained forest debris down on those beneath. Unsteady, he glanced to his left to see a fellow GI's chest explode, raining blood and tissue on anyone near him. Vertigo rocked his senses as he tried to get a grip on place and time. He fell face down onto the snow-covered, leaf-strewn forest floor. The clatter of tanks, human screams, and orders shouted in panic overwhelmed him. All around, the chaos of mechanized warfare bombarded his senses. Flashes, followed by the cracks of bullets on their way to unseen targets, created a violent thunderstorm in what otherwise would be a quiet woodland. "Run!" his mind screamed. Despite the cold, sweat stung his eyes. Wiping his forehead with his sleeve, it came back smeared in dirt and other men's blood. Survival instincts took over as bullets whizzed by over his head. "Run!" A glance behind and another ahead overwhelmed him with indecision. "Do something. This will get you killed." The shouts of his fellow soldiers intensified as more men succumbed to the withering barrage of bullets. He decided to escape in the direction from which he had came. No. He couldn't. The soldier drew an unsteady breath. The only thing stronger than a need for self-preservation remained his fear of being called a coward by his fellow soldiers. As men raced past him toward the chaos, he rose to his knees, bloody knuckles pressing into the dirty and leaf-littered snow. Finally, he pushed himself to a standing position. Off to the left, a large tree offered a temporary hiding place to check himself for injuries. He slipped beneath the wide branches and patted down his body. No significant wounds. Every explosion in the nearby forest shuddered the ground beneath him. He pressed his back into the mighty oak, but found no reassurance. He shut his eyes tight as bullets struck nearby trees, creating geysers of loosened tree bark to sting his exposed skin. Clamping his palms over his ears, he gasped for a breath. The tightness in his stomach intensified as he could still hear the cries of dying men calling for their mothers. Franklin, get your ass going. This isn't break time. The voice of his squad's master sergeant on his right snapped him out of his paralysis. He stepped beyond the safety of the tree just as he heard a muffled grunt. The master sergeant fell to the ground next to him, a gaping hole in the man's chest, and lifeless eyes pointed toward the sky. Dusk descended over the woods, which added a surreal quality to his surroundings. Desperation for survival prevailed over his worry of being considered a coward. He picked up his rifle with both hands and ran from the carnage. Navigating through the growing darkness and trying to avoid stumbling over bodies made for slow going. Finally, he broke out of a tree line. He stopped at the edge of the dirt path, looked both ways for the enemy, then glanced at the sky where the moon glowed through a thin layer of clouds. He crossed the narrow opening into another canopy of trees. Relief settled over him when he saw other men, just like himself, fleeing the battle. An unknown force pushed him forward. He stumbled. Searing pain traveled up his spine. He fell to the snow-covered ground. Breathing grew difficult, and a calmness swept over him. Finally, he lay still. He stood in a kaleidoscope of swirling colors. Within the lights, he heard voices beckoning him to approach the brightness. His long-dead mother called his name, and he felt her hand on his cheek. Scenes from his childhood flashed past as he walked toward the center of the brilliance. He gasped with the next vision, his girlfriend offering her unclothed body to him on the night prior to leaving for boot camp. He watched as a door closed. The bright colors ceased and cold engulfed him once again. His heart skipped a beat when he witnessed the events of that fateful night in Chicago. His final image before total darkness overtook him was the gangplank on the ship he would board for the journey to the battlefields of Europe. Struggling to regain awareness, he remembered the date to be December 16, 1944. The location he and other members of the 9th Infantry Regiment were assigned by Allied command was the Ardennes region of northeastern France. History would record this date as the start of the infamous Battle of the Bulge. Drifting in and out of consciousness, he lay in the snow, succumbing to a feeling of ultimate peace. Against his wishes, he awoke. Silence dominated his surroundings. He rose to his knees as cold, stiffened joints quickly turned the effort into a painful ordeal. Challenged by the agony, he struggled to stand. The butt of his M1 Garand lay close by. When he reached for it, pain seared through his body. Slowly, the agony subsided, and he used the rifle to push himself erect and surveyed his surroundings. Except for unmoving bodies posed in grotesque statues of death, he stood alone. The snow-covered forest floor, crimson with the frozen blood of dozens of his fallen brethren, met his gaze. The vertigo returned. Trembling, he reached into his front pocket for his compass, but found the glass cracked and the needle clattering around inside the small container. With a curse, he flicked the useless object into the brush. Orienting himself, he looked to the sky to find a gray overcast so thick the globe of the sun remained hidden. He knew the north to south path he crossed earlier lay behind him. So he turned to what he guessed to be west and set off to find other soldiers and an aid station. 30 minutes into his trek, he reached behind for his canteen, only to find a huge hole. Tipping the container up, not even a drop of water remained. After taking a deep breath, he let it out slowly and stood still for a moment. Studying the terrain, he listened for distant sounds of men or tools of war. Silence. Even the sound of birds and animals were missing. Putting one foot forward, he started to walk. After navigating the woodland for hours, he could not tell if he was making progress or just walking in circles. Several times he thought he recognized a fallen burned oak he had passed earlier. The sensation unnerved him. As dusk approached, he determined maneuvering through the thick timberland at night would be a fool's errand. He stopped to gather leaves and a few pieces of dry wood. No easy task, as much of the surroundings were covered with snow. Eventually, his hard work paid off when the pile of wood and leaves flared. Satisfied with his efforts, he watched the flames grow. With the fire established, he used his mess kit to melt snow for drinking water. No matter how much melted snow he drank, his thirst would not subside. Time passed slowly as the only discernible light emanated from the flames. The snap of a twig nearby brought him to full alert. He grabbed his rifle and pointed it in the sound's direction. "Who's there? Can you spare a wee bit of warmth with a fellow?" Standing, the soldier kept his weapon trained in the direction of the voice. "Come into the light, slowly. Show me your hands." The firelight flickered on something to the soldier's right. Pointing the gun in the direction of the object and voice, the shadow materialized into a man as it grew closer. The glow revealed a guy dressed in a mud-caked khaki uniform with leggings, a Brody helmet, and an Enfield rifle in one hand. The man said, "I don't mean to alarm you, laddie. I've heard that accent before, Southside Chicago. You're Irish, aren't you?" "Aye, you're a doughboy, right?" "Haven't heard the term for a while, but yeah, that's a strange uniform you're wearing." The man shrugged. "Only one I've got." "Sit, rest for a while." "I believe I will, thanks," the soldier said. "I'm with the 9th Infantry. 77th Division, 1st Battalion for me. Wish I had food to offer." The Irishman tilted his head. I know what you mean." He paused and gazed at the fire for a few minutes. "How long you been out here?" "Yesterday afternoon. We fell under attack and I got separated from my unit. I've been out here all night and day, lost. Yourself?" The newcomer didn't answer right away. "Yesterday, huh?" "Yeah." "You mentioned Chicago. That's where you're from?" The soldier smiled. "The name's Franklin." "I'm from Dublin myself. O'Reilly's mine." "Nice to meet you, O'Reilly. I've never been to Dublin." "Nor I Chicago." "You haven't missed anything." The soldier kept his attention on the fire and placed a few more large tree limbs onto the flames. "I can't seem to get warm." "It's winter in France, laddie. No one can." He poked at the blaze with a stick. Sparks scattered and glowed with the disturbance. The Irishman looked at his companion. "Good fire. Thanks for sharing." "You're welcome." He paused. "What's Dublin like?" The Irishman smiled. "Warmer than here." Franklin shivered. "Why is it so damn cold?" He paused as he concentrated on the flames. Finally, he asked, "Have you looked for your unit?" "Yes, but I'm sure they pulled out a long time ago." "You can hook up with mine as soon as I find them?" The soldier frowned as he observed the Irishman. He said, "You don't have an overcoat." A shrug answered the question. He held his hands closer to the fire and then studied the soldier. "Have you seen much combat?" "No, this is my first." He paused. "I've seen death up close before, but nothing like I saw yesterday." He took a deep breath, avoiding the Irishman's eyes as he let it out. O'Reilly did not respond except to stare at the flames. The two men remained silent for an extended length of time as the glow and the crackling flames seemed to be their only connection to the world. His thoughts drifted back to one night in Chicago. Finally, the soldier said, "Chicago can be a rough place." "Aye, so can Dublin." "Yeah, I can imagine." He looked at his companion. "Can I tell you something?" "Not the priest." "I know that, but I need to tell someone." "Go ahead. I might not listen." "That's okay." The Irishman concentrated his attention on the flames. Franklin said, "I got into a little trouble one night on the docks of Lake Michigan. You see, I used to work for a man who owned several bars in downtown Chicago. One night he sent me and another guy down there to pick up a load of bootleg booze from Canada. It seems he still had his contacts from Prohibition and a way to increase his profits by buying untaxed whiskey." Turning his attention to the soldier, the Irishman's expression stayed neutral. "Anyway, a couple of cops interrupted us." Wiping his mouth with his coat sleeve, the soldier continued, "Damn, it's cold." A nod came from O'Reilly. "The cops wanted us to cut a deal, let us go and keep the booze. They said they'd look the other way while we got the hell out of there. When I said no, they tried to arrest us. Taking a deep breath, Franklin looked toward the cloud-laden sky. I shot both of them and slipped their bodies into the water. I joined the army the next day and left for boot camp a week later. That explains why you're here? What do you mean? When you told me you hadn't seen much combat, I wondered why you're here. I'm not following you. Do you believe in heaven and hell, my American friend? He shrugged. The fire doesn't warm you, does it? O'Reilly asked. No, it doesn't. And you're hungry, right? Famished. Thirsty? The soldier nodded. You probably melted snow to drink, didn't you? Another nod. Afterward, you were still thirsty. Yeah. My friend from Chicago. You were in hell. The soldier blinked rapidly. What do you mean I'm in hell? You're joking, right? O'Reilly smiled. Am I? Think about it. You've been wandering around a forest for over a day looking for a road and can't find it. You see a tree you recognize or a funny-shaped rock you seem to remember. You walk in a straight line and still can't find your way out of the trees. Am I right? I got lost. No, you didn't. He paused. Get used to it. I've been wandering around this forest since 1918. I can't find my way out. And neither will you. Hell is supposed to be hot. Who said so? You a priest? The soldier frowned. I'm not Catholic. Doesn't matter. Hell is what torments us the most. I used to catch small rodents and roast them. It didn't ease my hunger, so I quit trying. I can drink water all day and I'm still thirsty. I can sit by a fire like the one you made and still shiver. We are doomed to walk this forest in the middle of winter for eternity. For a long time, the soldier studied the man who claimed to be from 1918. I don't believe you. His trust in those words not as confident as before. With a shrug, O'Reilly started to stand, but stopped and returned to the ground. Makes no difference if you believe me or not. You're in hell, my friend. The soldier smirked and asked in disbelief, Are there others like you? Thousands. I've seen them wandering around at night. However, you're the first one I've been able to have a conversation with. You're crazy. Am I? Think about it, Franklin. Where are the sounds of war? It's happening all around us, and we can't hear it or see it. We're not part of it anymore. Franklin's eyes widened. He wiped his mouth with his hand. The lips felt cold. Studying the Irishman, he said, This can't be happening. Oh, but it is. I can't be dead. I never got shot. The only bullets you hear are the ones that miss you. Stop it. He placed his palms over his ears and stared at the man sitting on the other side of the fire. I didn't hear the bullet that got to me either. He pointed to his head. Got it right below me helmet. How come I don't see the others you mentioned? You will, but they won't talk to you? You mean I'll be alone? Yes. O'Reilly stood and started to turn. How come you're talking to me? Not sure. I saw your fire and thought I'd try. He paused. Maybe I'm being offered a form of clemency. If I show some kindness to you by explaining what's going on, I might get out of here at some point in the future. After I died, no one told me. I had to figure it out on my own. The soldier got to his feet. Wait, I don't want to be alone. I get the feeling my time is limited to talk to you. This can't be true. I don't feel dead. The Irishman chuckled. How is dead supposed to feel, Franklin? I don't know. None of us know how death feels until we experience it. He turned again to leave. Why are you here? The Irishman looked back at him. I executed 3 German infantrymen after they were taken prisoners. Why? No reason, other than they were German and no one was around to see me do it. Still not believing the man, he reached to stop him from leaving. His hand passed through the Irishman's shoulder. O'Reilly gave the soldier a sad smile. See, I wasn't lying to you. While Franklin searched for words, he watched the figure disappear into the night. For several moments, he listened for sounds around him. Silence. No birds chirped or creatures scurried through the leaves. only silence. He looked skyward. Clouds raced past a full moon. A tear leaked from his eye and down his cheek. He stood still. For how long, he did not know. A mist formed as the fire flickered out. By the light of the moon, another figure approached his position at a slow walk. Thinking it might be the return of O'Reilly, he stepped away from the tree and watched the form approach. The clothes were wrong. The Irishman had not returned. The figure wore a German uniform. Franklin raised his rifle and shouted, "Stop!" The man ignored him and continued walking. Positioning himself in front of the oncoming soldier, Franklin shouted again, "Stop, or I'll shoot!" The figure did not stop or slow. Finally, it passed through him. The only thing Franklin felt was a cold breeze as he watched the specter disappear into the darkness.
Dragging a weary hand down his face, Thomas Vogel leaned over and grabbed the bottle of Kilbeggan sitting on the floor next to his plush office chair. The movement caused his chair's aged leather to issue an accusatory groan. "Oh, fuck you," Thomas murmured to it. "It's been a long winter and I put on a few pounds. No need to be an asshole." He waited to see if the chair had anything else to add. It didn't. Then threw back a lengthy swig of the harsh Irish whiskey. The liquor seared its way down his esophagus and filled his torso with a caustic but not unpleasant warmth. Smiling at it, Thomas set the bottle on his desktop in front of him and inched his chair forward until his belly was touching the desk's edge. "Okay then," he said, shifting his attention to his laptop's 17-inch display. On it, pictures of his late wife Karen cycled every few seconds. Her spray painting a rose at Graffiti Park in Austin, Texas. The two of them curled up in a hammock out back. Her dancing her ass off at a Chili Peppers concert. Her staring adoringly at him as he posed in his navy whites. A close-up of her face, which he had taken while she stood naked in the shower. She had only let him keep the image after he promised to crop out all the naughty bits. Thomas lingered on the memory and felt a familiar wave of nostalgia wash over him, which of course was the point of these particular pictures, to remind him of all the wondrous times they had had throughout their journey together, and to highlight how amazing and carefree Karen had been before her demons had arrived and changed everything. No, his inner voice cut in, as it always seemed to whenever he tried focusing on the good parts. Not just changed, they ruined everything. Ruined, he heard himself whisper, and like that, the nostalgia he was feeling was gone. The picture on the laptop screen changed then, switching to a shot of Thomas and Karen standing in front of their newly purchased sportscraft fishing boat. Thomas blinked numbly at the image and frowned. When he had first configured the screensaver slideshow, he started with a pool of 50 and reduced it to 26. Lovely as it may have been, this photo hadn't even been part of the initial 50, which begged the question, how had it ended up in there? "Sure it wasn't you," his inner voice edged in again. "Been hitting the whiskey pretty hard lately. Maybe you did it and just don't remember." Thomas eyed the Kilbeggan's bottle. Though he was loath to admit it, the hypothesis certainly had its merits. "Maybe," he said. As he did, a strange buzzing sensation purled in his head, and he felt his thoughts fracture and fragment. The sensation didn't hurt exactly, but it sure made it difficult to concentrate. It took a few minutes for the feeling to subside. Once it had, Thomas found that he no longer cared about the additional image. It was there now, probably a result of his having moved it there during one of his numerous blackouts. So that was that. What concerned him more was his reasoning for visiting the study in the first place. The other photo collection. The special one. Right, he said, grabbing the laptop's wireless mouse. He gave it a little jerk and the screensaver ended. Behind it awaited a small prompt asking for a username and password. Once past this, he launched a File Explorer app and commenced navigating his way through the hard drive's directory structure. 20 or so clicks later, he arrived at a folder called Registry Extensions, within which resided 38 subfolders, each bearing a 5-digit label. Thomas scrolled down to the one marked 47782 and clicked on it, bringing up another username and password prompt. He entered the appropriate credentials and clicked OK. The password window vanished, revealing a collection of 14 high-resolution JPEGs. Taking another swig from the bottle, Thomas opened the topmost pic. The laptop's mediocre processor whirred with activity as it coerced its outmoded graphics card to display what appeared to be a large, keg-shaped something nestled in the ocean floor. If he remembered correctly, it had been mid-autumn when he had taken the pic. He had been out on the sports craft, trolling the depths of Wausau Sound in search of sunken treasure, a hobby of his since the late 90s. As was his habit, he had selected a spot at random, dropped anchor, and cast his fancy magnetometer into the shimmering waters. Almost immediately, the device had begun beeping. Figuring it had to be a glitch, Thomas had reeled it back in, hooked it up to his computer, and initiated a set of diagnostics. When those came back clean, he generated a findings report, which indicated a mass the size and shape of a large boat anchor. Boat anchor, Thomas thought as he studied the object. Not quite. He was just about to close the image and move on to his favorite in the collection, the 13th, when a white-hot ball of pain swept through the pleura surrounding his left lung. Christ almighty, he said, thrusting backwards and clutching a hand to his chest. The ball took 3 more passes through his torso before disintegrating into an echo of pain. Fucking fuck, Thomas said, sitting up and collecting himself. While Karen's demons had been largely mental, Thomas's main tormentor, mesothelioma, was a decidedly physical one. Between the coffin fits, bouts of fatigue, and random pleural flares, like the one he had just experienced, he rarely went an hour without being reminded of its presence inside him. I hadn't forgotten, he told the disease as he lifted the Kilbeggan's bottle to his lips. You and me until the end. He drained the last 2 swigs of whiskey and set the bottle back on the floor. After a time, his gaze returned to the laptop and the last image displayed there, image 13, a close-up shot of the object's fully excavated front end. As he had with the first pic, Thomas thought back to the day he had taken it and recalled how goddamn arduous it had been to chip away all the barnacles and plankton covering the thing. Equipped with the most basic of tools, a hammer, chisel, and heavy-duty scraper, it had taken 4 different dives and 4 oxygen tanks to get the job done. Brutal work, but as the saying went, the juice had definitely been worth the squeeze. Without it, he might never have discovered the 5 small digits embossed across its black metal surface, 47782. 9 months had passed since that fateful day. 8 months since he had learned what the digits meant, and he still had trouble processing the magnitude of what he had found. The fact that he, Thomas Vogel, amateur treasure hunter with a death sentence in his lung, had been the one to discover it truly boggled his mind. Given how many others, to include 3 major government expeditions, had been looking for it since it disappeared some 70 years ago, the odds it would be him had to be astronomical, like winning the lottery astronomical. In a way, Thomas supposed he had won the lottery. A different kind of lottery, sure, but one that would surely reap its own sizable rewards. Money, at the very least, some fame and notoriety, and a place in the history books if he had his way. But that was a little bit of the old cart before the horse, wasn't it? He still had to wrest the thing from the seabed, a task he reckoned would take a minimum of 4 more digs, assuming some fucking hurricane didn't come along and undo all his work in the meantime. Then, of course, came the matter of getting it out of the water and onto his boat, something he had no idea how to do. Thomas sighed wearily at the thought. How indeed, he started to say when a door creaked somewhere in his large Victorian manner. Alarmed, Thomas swiveled his chair around and faced the study's open doorway. Beyond it, total darkness reigned. The creaking paused, resumed again, and was followed by a gentle tapping sound. Having spent his entire childhood in the manor, and having eventually moved back in after his father passed away in the mid-90s, Thomas knew all of the structure's murmurs and susurrations intimately. What he had just heard was the door leading from the kitchen into the rear courtyard opening and closing, which was odd, because he distinctly remembered locking it after doing the dishes. Hoping he had imagined the sound, Thomas sat still and listened intently to the house. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then the faint little creaks began working their way inward from the kitchen. "What the fuck?" he whispered, opening the desk's top right drawer, where his .38 revolver lived. After lifting it out and checking to see it was loaded, he set the gun on the desk and pulled the laptop shut, extinguishing the LCD's glow. The creaking paused in concert with this, then abruptly sped up, seeming to head straight for the study. Startled, Thomas stood, grabbed the gun, and cocked the hammer. "Keep on coming if you want a bullet in the face," he said. The intruder stopped somewhere in the hallway. Thomas raised the .38. "Whoever you are, please don't be stupid. Walk away now, and nothing happens. Stay, and things get ugly." A hushed chortle wormed its way through the open doorway. With it came a cold, husky voice. "I'd say things are already ugly, wouldn't you?" "Funny," Thomas said. "How about we keep them from getting any uglier?" The intruder grunted softly in the dark, but said nothing. An uneasy silence filled the air. Seconds ticked by. "Well," Thomas finally called out, "what'll it be?" As the words left his tongue, it occurred to him how uncommonly put together he felt. He was on edge, yes, charged with adrenaline, but he didn't feel scared or panicky. If anything, he felt at peace with the situation. Whether this was the whiskey's doing, or the mesotheliomas, or a combo of the two, he couldn't say, but he was glad for it all the same. "Interesting," the intruder said. Thomas had barely registered this when a leaden fist came hurtling out of the dark, striking him in the temple and sending him headlong into unconsciousness. A short time later, the sound of a clock striking 3 roused Thomas from his forced slumber. As he gradually wakened, the last vestiges of the dream he had been having echoed faintly in his head. While the details were sketchy, he knew it had been about Karen and that he had been enjoying it. "Karen," he muttered, flittering open his eyes and watching the firelight dance about the manor's spacious communion room. Realizing he was no longer in the study, Thomas sat upright and panned across the large room, taking in all the antique curios, armoires, tapestries, sofas, and claw-footed side pieces that adorned it, including the green chaise lounge upon which he currently lay. A subtle movement brought his gaze to the vaulted chair directly across from him. "Welcome back," the man sitting in it said. Thomas frowned as his brain struggled to make sense of the situation. Who the hell are you? The man, who sported a totally bald head and gray beard and wore a dated tweed suit, crossed his legs, smiled, and said, Just a visitor. All at once, everything came rushing back to Thomas. The door creaking open, footsteps, being attacked. What is this? He demanded, leaping up from the shay. What the fuck are you doing in my goddamn house?
Please, sit. Relax.
Thomas went to tell him to go fuck himself, but instead did as the man instructed. I'm sitting, he said, easing himself back onto the shay lounge. I don't know why, but I am.
The product of consumption,
the man explained, a glint of pleasure in his eyes. What?
Your fight-or-flight instinct. I liberated it. Trust me, it's for the best.
Thomas sneered at this, shook his head. I ask you who you are and what you're doing here. He glanced down at himself and noted that he was dressed in plaid pajamas. And how did I get in these?
My name,
the man replied,
is Eldon Headley, and I dressed you in those while you were unconscious. You vomited all over yourself after you fell, so I changed you.
He gazed querulously about the communion room.
I'm curious about this chamber. It's the only one in the house decorated in antiquity. Is there a story behind it?
My wife Karen's doing, Thomas responded compliantly. She was obsessed with antiques. When we moved in after my father passed, she wanted to decorate the whole place according to its Victorian design. I like modern decor, so I said no. We compromised on this room and she ran with it. Thomas paused and glared at the old man. Now, why the fuck did I just tell you all that?
Tricks of the trade, my boy. Tricks of the trade.
Just answer the fucking question, will you? Eldon Headley grinned, revealing a chasm of abnormally long teeth. His whole body then blurred, and in the next instant, he was sitting on the shay beside Thomas. He carried with him a sickly sweet scent, like strawberries mixed with upturned earth, and had Thomas's .38 gripped in his large right hand. Thomas flinched. How did you...
Smith & Wesson,
the man cut in, flipping open the .38 cylinder and letting the bullets fall to the floor.
A well-crafted weapon. Hardy stainless steel, composite rubber grip.
He closed his hand around the gun, and Thomas watched it crumple like a beer can. The man squeezed harder, and when he reopened his hand, the gun was a ball of steel and rubber. Heavens, Thomas said. What the hell are you? Headley turned his head and peered directly into Thomas's eyes. His face, Thomas now saw, was like that of a death camp survivor. Skeletal and pale, the eyes sunken, the cheekbones sharp.
There is an old Greek word for what I am, but you would know me by a somewhat violent term.
He waited for Thomas to guess. Thomas considered everything he just witnessed, the display of speed and strength, the teeth, and though it went against his better judgment, he said, Vampire? The man stood and moved to the sofa next to the lounge, giving Thomas his space.
Unfortunately, that is the closest approximation we have, and quite a poor and distant one it is.
Thomas recoiled. Did you come here to drink my blood? As soon as he asked the question, he felt ridiculous for having asked it.
A fabrication of pseudo-imaginative men.
Headley said, steepling his long fingers together.
No. My kind prefers convectius quidditas.
When Thomas showed no sign of having heard of it, he went on.
It is an old term that medieval philosophers once used to encapsulate the essence of a thing, the whatness of it. Applied to humanity, it is your vitality, your very being.
Right, Thomas said, not getting it, but thinking it sounded like a bunch of pretentious metaphysical bullshit. So, it's not flowing in my veins then?
Not as such. The conduit of quiddity in humans lies within your psyches.
The old man leaned toward Thomas, shadows dancing on his bony face.
You, my friend, are radiating with it, which is what attracted me to you. Lucky for you, others of my kind did not find you first.
Thomas turned away from his uninvited guest and pondered everything the man had just told him. Part of him outright rejected it all as pure lunacy. A much bigger part, however, believed it, pretentiousness and all. He could feel the bigger part rapidly consuming the littler part.
I see you have some questions,
said Headley. Thomas laughed. The king of all understatements.
So, ask.
Thomas sat up straight. He noticed the pain in his head had receded, though a slight dizziness remained. He cleared his throat. Are you, dead? The corners of Headley's lips twitched upwards.
Yes and no. One night in December of 1793, I went to sleep and changed. In the genetic sense. To use the current vernacular, all of my cells shut down and rebooted themselves. When I awoke, I no longer functioned by the same physical rules that you do. And yeah, there are other rules.
He waved his hand.
It is far more complex than that, of course, but I deduce you get the general idea.
Thomas took a beat to let it all sink in, which it did far more easily than it seemed it should have. Did you originally plan on feeding on me?
Certainly,
Headley replied.
And in fact, I have fed on you, just a little bit. It was quite impossible not to. It's why you're so amenable right now.
Thomas bridled at that. Would your feeding have killed me?
I would have drawn it out over weeks and months, but eventually, yes. The process would have stopped your neurons from functioning.
Thomas stared absently across the room. I'm almost afraid to ask, but what made you change your mind about me? The long, jagged teeth reappeared, and Headley extended a long arm to the room's marble coffee table, where Thomas's laptop sat with its screen closed. The Phrycolicus picked the device up, opened the screen, and tapped the spacebar, bringing up a mosaic of photographs.
Because you found this.
Thomas's brow furrowed. You know what that is? The man regarded the photos with an almost loving gaze.
February 5th, 1958,
he said in way of an answer.
I was living in Canada at the time, but kept frequent tabs on news from around the world. Something that was much harder back then, but possible if you had the resources. Anyway, over the next few months, I followed the recovery efforts and became intrigued by the U.S. government's utter failure to gain any closure. Later, when they officially called off the search, I relocated to Tybee Island and vowed to find it myself.
He huffed.
The place was quite different than I remembered. But then, it was my first time back to Georgia since I was stationed at Fort Screven back in '62. A glorious time that was, the American Civil War. Such sustenance.
He looked off into space, appearing lost in reverie.
I looked for it now and then for almost 20 years. Finally, the Tangshan earthquake drew my interest to northeast China, and off I went.
Thomas rubbed his chin. Why were you so interested in it back then? And what could you possibly want with it now? Headley handed the laptop to Thomas.
What I'd rather talk about is why you want it.
Thomas eyed the images on the screen momentarily, then set the laptop on the coffee table and wandered over to the fireplace. Across the mantel stood a dozen family photos. Thomas honed in on the one of he and Karen sharing a kiss beneath the Eiffel Tower. It had been taken during their honeymoon by a friendly Parisian who was the antithesis of French stereotypes. Thomas never tired of staring at that photo. He had been 25, Karen 24, both of them appearing so young and vibrant.
I sense a story coming,
Headley said.
Excellent.
So you know, this makes me want to bash your head in, Thomas said, referring to the overwhelming compulsion he felt to explain himself. He inhaled deeply and let it out through his nose. My wife Karen had already been in a state of decline when we first met. Bipolar disorder, which she inherited from both of her parents. To her credit, she had a pretty good grip on it when we crossed paths at Savannah State. She was nervous when she broke the news to me, but I was battling a serious bout of depression back then and told her not to sweat it. We all have our shit, right? She literally sang with relief. Singing was one of her coping mechanisms. We married during our senior year, and I joined the Navy after graduation. The nomadic lifestyle suited us both, and for a while I think we were happy. Thomas lifted the Eiffel Tower picture and caressed it tenderly. After 2 tours, I decided to leave the service, and we wound up settling back in Savannah. Per my father's request, I took over his boating business, and Karen landed a full-time teaching gig at Grantham Middle School. By then, her mood swings had gotten problematic. Karen, though, got it under control with new meds and by throwing herself fully into teaching, which she loved. Thomas stopped. I hate this.
I know,
Headley said.
Please continue.
Thomas growled. Little by little, elements of her job started to chip away at her. The endless bickering between her co-workers, piss-poor management by the administrators above her, mandatory programs like No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and Common Core, doing more harm than good. The merciless cutbacks in funding and personnel. The absurd anti-teacher movement that quite effectively turned the middle class in on itself. Karen did her damnedest to endure all the bullshit. But in time, the weight became unbearable. The final straw came after she led a protest against all the compulsory testing the state kept cramming down their throats. She encouraged the students to boycott the exams. Consequently, the protests were a huge success, huge enough to spread to other districts.
But the state didn't like that, did they?
Headley said. No, they did not. Atlanta stepped in and quietly put the screws to Karen, pressuring her administrators to act upon every little infraction she committed, to include taking a non-scheduled bathroom break. Finally, They terminated her contract after she colorfully dressed down the parent who accused her of giving their child too much homework.
Must have been a hard pill to swallow,
Headley said with a hint of a smile. Thomas glowered at the Vrykolikas. By the time Karen received her dismissal papers, there wasn't much left of the woman I knew. Just a deflated, empty husk that could no longer see the point in carrying on. A few nights later, she snuck into the guest bathroom with a straight razor and a bottle of Xanax, and punched her ticket to the other shore. Thomas paused there and returned the picture to the mantel.
You were the one to find her, yes?
Headley asked. Yes.
But there's more,
said the Vrykolikas.
Your story, your illness.
Thomas felt his nostrils flare. If you already know all of this, why the fuck have me recite it to you?
Impressions,
Headley asserted.
That is all I get. Impressions. Like with the disease creeping its way from the pleura surrounding your lungs into the neighboring tissue. There is an impression, but nothing more. So,
he flittered his hand at Thomas. Rubbing his jaw irritably, Thomas said, Sooner or later something gets all of us. All of us, Mr. Headley. Had it just been poor genes, I wouldn't have much minded. But I got the meso-lung crap during my run working the shipyards in Norfolk, which also wouldn't have bothered me so much if not for the VA's outright refusal to treat me for it. See, the disease was clever and waited 15 years after I left the service to kick in. When I tried to file the paperwork to get it categorized as service-related, though, the VA said it didn't qualify. I had mountains of evidence citing how badly infested my work environment was with asbestos, but for some reason, the VA mired me in red tape. I fought their decision with everything I had, but those sons of bitches wouldn't budge. I burned up a lot of money on lawyers and research, all for nothing. Thomas clenched his fists and sensed his heartbeat quickening. To make matters worse, he went on, the insurance through the boating business tagged it as a pre-existing condition, covering very little of the treatment cost. Talk about your utter lack of humanity. He shook his head. Between all of that and Karen's death, I came to see things in a very different light. Headley appeared to meditate on everything Thomas had just imparted.
So,
he said, nodding towards the laptop.
A means to an end, then?
Thomas shrugged. What's your impression telling you? The Vrykolikas rose to his feet and joined Thomas by the fireplace.
Indeed,
he said.
Well, my new friend, I believe we can help one another. You need resources. I can commission a vessel of the appropriate size and outfitting to retrieve it.
A peculiar form of joy flared in Thomas's chest, driving him to grab the laptop and enlarge the latest photo. There's still some work to be done prying it out of the sediment down there. It may take a few trips. Headley tutted and pointed to the balled-up revolver.
That was nothing to me, my boy. I will dislodge it myself.
Thomas eyed the crushed weapon. Absurd as it was, he had no doubt the Vrykolikas could do it. In that case, he said, I think it's a quid pro quo time, Dr. Lecter. Headley issued a jovial chuckle.
Dr. Lecter. That's good.
He chuckled once more, then took a deep breath and proceeded to tell Thomas what he wanted out of the deal. He cut no corners in his explanation, spared no detail. Thomas found the Vrykolikas' reasons deeply unsettling, but supposed he was in no position to pass judgment. When Headley was done speaking, he blurred for an instant and reappeared in the doorway leading back to the kitchen.
I will return in 7 days. At noon sharp. Please be ready, Mr. Vogel.
Thomas was about to ask why they needed to wait so long when a fierce fizzling sensation filled his head, rendering him speechless. The sensation only lasted a few minutes but was powerful enough to leave Thomas woozy and confused. Fearing he might collapse from it, he sat on the nearest sofa and glanced around the room in search of Headley. The Vrykolakus was no longer there. Thomas said, wondering if he had hallucinated the whole exchange. Deciding he hadn't, he wasn't ready to go down that road just yet. He stood and, feeling clear-headed enough, ambled back to the fireplace. "Well, baby," he said to the Eiffel Tower photo, "it looks like it won't be a boring end for me after all." So saying, he turned and headed off to bed. At precisely noon a week later, Headley came rumbling up the manor's long flagstone driveway in a monstrous F-350 with an enclosed titanium trailer in tow. Thomas, having spotted the truck a mile off, wandered down from the manor's wraparound porch and directed the Vrykolakus to park behind his '99 Toyota Corolla. Headley did as instructed and killed the engine. Thomas noted that the words Sweeney's Construction Company were printed in yellow across the F-350's driver's side door.
As promised,
Headley said, stepping down from the truck's elevated cab and into the harsh midday sun, which, Thomas observed, magnified his sickly appearance tenfold. Of particular note was the Vrykolakus's skin, now seeming more ashen than pale. Its tincture something the fine folks at Crayola might have called elephant gray. It also looked somehow tighter than before, as if it had been shrink-wrapped to his bones. Furthermore, it bore dozens of nasty little pockmarks, which Thomas hadn't previously noticed.
"Pretty, isn't it?"
Headley said, adjusting his dark sunglasses.
"While we can walk in sunlight without issue, my kind prefers to avoid it when possible. That sliver of the law, at least, has roots in truth."
He glanced up at Thomas. As before, he was dressed in a suit of an unknown vintage, this one black and double-breasted.
"Looking at me now, you can understand why."
To keep from staring, Thomas motioned to the F-350.
"You in the construction business?"
Headley nodded.
"Lived long as I have, and you learn to get your fingers in a lot of pies."
"I'm sure," said Thomas, indicating the trailer.
"Strong enough to hold 7,600 pounds? 10,000 per its rating."
"And the ship?"
"A modified platform supply vessel named the Viking's Fury. It's smaller than most PSVs, but well capable of accommodating our needs. It'll be waiting for us at the marina in Thunderbolt on the Wilmington River. My associate owns the marina and will ask no questions."
Thomas knew the place, just south of the Saffold Drive Bridge and a stone's throw from Savannah State University. It was a good spot to meet the PSV, much more so than, say, the Garden City or Ocean Terminals, both of which fell under the auspices of the Georgia Port Authority. Trouble they did not need.
"A ship like that'll need a crew." "And it will have one,"
the Vrykolakus replied, checking his watch.
"It's time to go."
An echo of the fizzling Thomas had felt the night they met came and went again. Thomas huffed irritably at it, rubbed his temples, and went to retrieve his gear. He loaded his things into the back of the F-350 and climbed into the passenger seat. Headley strapped on his seatbelt and brought the truck's rumbling V8 to life.
"Now, my boy, let's go make history."
While technically within the Savannah Metropolitan Statistical Area, Thomas's manor actually sat just outside of Savannah proper, in nearby Bloomingdale. From the front door, it took roughly 20 minutes to reach Thunderbolt. During the drive, Thomas prodded Headley for more on his existence as a Rockolicus. Headley was curiously generous in his answers, fielding Thomas's inquiries with open aplomb. The two items Thomas most wanted to know about involved the Rockolicus' lifespan, how long they had been around, and how long did they live. As Headley understood it, his kind had originated in Anatolia sometime within the 4th century BC. He could offer no precise date of origin because numerous Rockolicus had come into being at various points throughout the century, most notably Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great. Regardless of the date, Headley believed their arrival marked the advent of a new evolutionary divergence. Since such divergences often took millennia to fully manifest, it was reasonable to assume his kind was still in its infancy. As to their lifespan, Headley claimed a few of the originals were still around.
As long as a Rockolicus has Quiddity to feed on, we can go on living for quite some time.
Do you ever get sick or feel pain?
Only in the absence of Quiddity,
Headley admitted.
Then the pain is unimaginable.
Headley's associate, a wizened, silver-tongued old fisherman named Barkley, met them as they pulled into the marina's parking lot. After a puzzling exchange of insults, the two shook hands warmly, and Barkley pointed to the Viking's Fury, which was already moored and set to go.
There she is, as promised, my friend,
the man said. Thomas had the impression the two went way back.
This way, if you please.
They boarded swiftly, and Barkley introduced them to the crew, 4 grizzled sailors and their slightly less grizzled captain. Following the introductions, Headley conferred with the captain, while the others set to work unmooring the vessel. Afterwards, the captain approached Thomas for the necessary coordinates. Thomas provided them, and less than 5 minutes later, they embarked. The trip down the Wilmington was slow and peaceful. Thomas spent the majority of it pacing about the stern, checking out the boat's riggings and watching the land creep by. Occasionally, river children appeared along the shoreline, muddy and waving frenetically, and Thomas waved back at them. The ship had just passed the inlet to Skidaway River when Headley joined Thomas by the starboard taffrail.
I've always preferred the land over the sea, but there is something about being on a ship that beckons to the soul.
Thomas nodded. Throughout the 57 years he had been alive, the majority of the instances in which he experienced true tranquility had occurred while he was surrounded by vast expanses of water.
In case you still have doubts about the crew,
Headley said, changing subjects.
Look there.
He indicated a nearby crewman who was busy fitting pieces of a large wooden crate together. Work it should have taken at least 2 men to accomplish.
Notice his pallor?
Headley asked.
Notice his clothes?
The man had on a dirty blue sweater and equally dirty corduroys, garments suited for much cooler weather. The man's skin was also quite pale, a rarity for a southern sea dog. The 2 points struck home.
He's like you,
Thomas said.
The other 3 as well?
Yes, Headley replied.
I employ many of my kind in my various endeavors, and I help them become what they are meant to become.
Do they know what we're doing?
They will when we bring it aboard. They're not fools, but rest assured our plans will not be affected.
Headley let this hang in the air before striding off towards the companionway that accessed the ship's elevated bridge. As soon as Headley was out of sight, the crewman they had just been talking about grinned over at Thomas, and the now familiar fizzling sensation enveloped Thomas's brain. Distraught by the intensity of the feeling, Thomas shouted at the Rockolicus to leave him be. A millisecond later, the crewman fell to the deck, grabbing his head as if to keep it from coming apart. In a fit of self-preservation, he made several strange hand signals in the direction of the bridge, and all at once his torment stopped. Teeth clenched, he got up and scurried toward the ship's main cabin, upon which the bridge sat like a head upon a neck. Once inside, he slammed the door shut behind him. Thomas snarled after the fleeing crewman, issuing a string of obscenities. Headley feeding on him was one thing. He'd be damned if he let the other cretins do it too.
Leeches!
He shouted at the lot of them, only to be drowned out by a loud horn blast that emanated from the ship's intercom. Befuddled, Thomas looked about and noticed the land on both sides receding, giving way to an immense gulf of shimmering water.
Walsall Sound!
A voice called from somewhere above him. Thomas looked up and saw Headley standing atop the companionway.
No shit!
Thomas barked back, the aggravation of having been fed upon still well stoked.
Eldon, we need to talk. I know, and I'll put a stop to it,
Headley replied.
I guess I should be grateful, but if it happens again by any of you, I'm done.
Headley seemed amused by the demand.
Sure,
he said, angling his face toward the open sea.
The captain says it'll be another hour. There's food in the galley for you if you wish.
He flashed one of his long-toothed smiles and returned to the bridge. Wondering if the Vrockolicus would keep his word, Thomas meandered to the vessel's port side and fixed his gaze on the sea. The sight of all those sparkling little waves placated him, making quick work of his distress like few other things could. He waited until he was sufficiently calmed, then sought out his gear and fished some of his pain meds from his dry bag. The ones he had ate at breakfast were beginning to wear off, and he had no intention of suffering needlessly throughout the extraction process. Washing the pills down with a swig from the fresh bottle of Kilbeggins he had brought with him, he found a quiet spot near the ship's stern and spent the next hour lost in the ocean's beauty. Headley had been underwater at the bottom of Walsall Sound for almost 10 minutes when the chain sets fixed to the ship's larger crane began to shake violently. Less than a minute later, the chains went still and taut. Observing this, the crewman manning the crane's controls engaged the hoisting motor, and the thick wire rope started to retract. It took another 10 minutes before the black metal object broke the surface, a 7,600-pound Lazarus resurrected from its watery grave. Up it went, wrapped tightly in nylon slings, and then down into the crate it lowered. Thomas's heart pounded the entire time, and tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. There was a splashing sound on the starboard side, and Headley came crawling back aboard. He toweled off, dressed, and conferred again with the captain. They did not speak very long, and when they were finished, Headley watched the crewmen remove the slings from the Mark 15 thermonuclear bomb. The men did their work in silence and retreated to the main cabin when there was nothing left to do. In their absence, Headley called Thomas over to the crate.
So,
Headley said,
the easy part is finished. Now comes the much harder part.
Thomas studied the bomb, admiring its fully excavated form. Part of him never believed it would see the light of day.
Yeah, you know, we never discussed this before, but you're aware there was always a chance the part that sets it off, the detonator capsule, was removed.
Headley grinned.
No, my friend. This beautiful device is fully intact. There are some modifications to make, yes, but those are minor.
The look in his eyes said he knew for sure, and Thomas accepted that. The Vrockolicus's long, thin fingers grasped Thomas's shoulder, almost tenderly, and then he became a blur. Where he went, Thomas didn't know or care. For a while thereafter, Thomas remained by the crate, eyes bouncing from the Mark 15 to the sea and back again. Amid the bouncing, he thought of Oppenheimer's famous paraphrasing of the Bhagavad Gita quote years after the first atomic detonation at Trinity. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." At that precise moment, the quote aptly summed up how Thomas felt. Only he would have replaced the word worlds with cities and sanded cities down to its singular form. As to which particular city, he wasn't quite sure yet, but he had a couple in mind. The U-Haul cargo van pulled off of Massachusetts Avenue onto Louisiana and slowed to a crawl. Ahead on the right appeared a run of 3 open parking spots. Seeing them, Thomas eased the van in and shut the engine off. It had been a week since they rescued the bomb from the ocean floor, and only 3 days since Headley had returned from Panama City, where he had gone to visit a munitions expert regarding the detonator capsule. When the Rockolicus returned, he seemed pleased, and he and Thomas resumed an unfinished conversation about the where of their plan. Thomas had been dead set on Atlanta, as much of his anguish stemmed from the state capital. Headley, meanwhile, pushed Thomas to think bigger, much bigger. They came to an impasse, which Thomas luckily got them out of by deciding Headley was right. Thomas recalled a great deal of the fizzling going on in his head, but afterwards he no longer understood what the feeling meant. He just knew Headley was absolutely right, and agreed going up north was the best plan. From where he was parked, he could just make out the bone-white dome of the Capitol building. It was an impressive structure in an impressive city. Thomas removed the keys from the ignition and eyed his watch. 5 minutes until 3. 5 minutes until showtime. He tried to remember what that meant exactly, but those details had gone a little fuzzy. It seemed that part of him was gone now. He was about to crack open a can of Sprite when someone knocked on the driver's window. A city cop, Thomas saw. The man was tall and dark-skinned, with kind, beautiful eyes and a friendly expression. Thomas rolled the window down.
"Hi there."
"Afternoon, sir," the cop said, smiling.
"This your van?"
The easy way he spoke told Thomas he was a good man, a professional who had joined the force because he genuinely wanted to help. The devoted father and husband type.
"My boss's rental,"
Thomas said, meaning Headley.
There a problem?"
The cop asked him to get out of the vehicle. Thomas did, and they walked around to the U-Haul's rear end, which hung nearly to the ground with the Mark 15's weight.
"Got something heavy in there?"
the cop asked.
"Yep,"
Thomas replied.
"Mind if we take a look?"
Thomas looked at his watch again. 1 minute until noon.
"I don't see why not,"
he said, and opened the rolling door. The cop peered inside. His face instantly changed, and his instincts brought his hand to his sidearm.
"Sir, what the hell is that?"
"A Mark 15 nuclear bomb," Thomas replied.
"The Tybee bomb, it's called. I found it in the ocean near Savannah and brought it up here."
The cop pointed his gun at Thomas. He looked scared. He spoke frantically into his radio, calling for help. The sight of his fear stirred something in Thomas, and a lingering nuance of what was happening came to him. The nuance showed him his boiling hatred, and it coupled with the sense of how many innocent people, how many good men, women, and children would perish if he reached in his pocket and activated the remote detonator. The notion unhinged him, and everything got muddled in his head.
"I'm sorry, officer,"
he said, feeling now like a ghost instead of a man, like someone who had been partially eaten by a lion and left to die in the wilderness.
"I really am sorry. I don't want to do it."
The cop was yelling at him to get down, yelling into his radio to start evacuating everyone and everything.
"Jesus,"
he said.
"My wife and son, Sheila, Danny."
Thomas checked his watch. 1 minute passed.
"Karen,"
he said, falling to his knees weeping.
I'm sorry, baby. I can't do it. I just can't do it.
He set the remote detonator on the asphalt and put his hands behind his head. Downtown Baltimore. Eldon Headley sat alone at a small wrought iron table outside a coffee shop called Grounds for Happiness. He sipped his flavorless coffee and eyed his Rolex. A minute past noon. Around him, young people chatted excitedly while staring at their cell phones, a trend Headley did not understand. He waited another minute before deciding Thomas had failed him. Unconcerned, he got his own cell phone out and dialed the magic number. His thumb hovered over the call button, then gently pressed it. He set the phone on the table. Seconds later, the southwestern sky became brighter than 1,000 suns. People screamed, covering their eyes. Soon the ground began rumbling as if struck by a mild earthquake. More screaming. Windows shattered. People fell to the ground. Electronics ceased working. 3.8 megatons in full effect. Headley removed his sunglasses and watched as the mushroom cloud bloomed up from the nation's capital. Already he could feel the floodgates opening, the millions of conduits full and flowing. He stood and prepared himself for the grand feast. He would start here and circle around D.C., or what was left of it. The way he figured, the closer to the epicenter, the higher the suffering. After his first time around, if all went well, he would be able to feel something besides pain again. He would know his own quiddity, or something close to it. If not, he would start over and keep going round and round until he did. Straightening his tie, Headley pushed in his chair and began the feeding.
The devil doesn't come dressed in a red cape and pointy horns. He comes as everything you've ever wished for. Tucker Max. Chapter 1. The Penthouse. Thomas stared out over New York from the 34th floor of Manhattan Dynamics Corporate Center, amused at how he could look down on the world. It had taken a lot of hard work to become the youngest CEO in the company's history. Sipping his wonderfully aged scotch, he stood before the full-length windows and admired the city at night, feeling as though a king must feel when he stares down from his tower over his kingdom. "Good night, Mr. Burkhoff," Jillian said as she finished buttoning her shirt and fluffing her silky blonde hair before exiting the office. Thomas gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Entering the private bathroom in his office to catch a shower before heading home, he wondered how his son, Thomas II, was doing. Home life had become boring to him. He carried on with the farce of his marriage to maintain the other half of his assets. Besides, she was probably getting her own side action anyways. Thomas would spend 2 or 3 days at the office before coming home for a day. The penthouse suite they resided in was well decorated and furnished. The walls contained more art than family memories. Thomas Sr. was far more interested in grooming a future CEO than being a caring father. Thomas II had learned the benefits of charisma and ruthlessness from his father. High school had been his training ground to hone his skills for the business world after college. When Thomas Sr. would come home, the conversation focused more on lessons of self-advancement at all costs than real bonding time with his son. Thomas was proud of what his son was becoming. The conversations they had when he was home made his time away from the office bearable, if not almost worth it. Success demands sacrifice, he had once told his son. The acceptance letters from Ivy League colleges should be arriving in the mail soon. Thomas expected nothing less. After the shower, Thomas dressed in a handsome Giorgio Armani suit, impeccably pressed white Turnbull and Acer collared shirt, the Cole Haan wingtips in a beautiful burnt honey color. Thomas rarely existed outside of a well-tailored suit. His suits were his armor, and in them, he felt invincible. Thomas polished off the last of his scotch and approached the elevator, illuminating the down button with a touch. As he stood waiting, he scrolled through tomorrow's calendar. Meeting at 10 a.m. with the board. Meeting with the lawyers about a lawsuit pertaining to a company they purchased at 11 a.m. On and on and on. A soft ding caused Thomas to slide his phone into the inner breast pocket of his suit. The stainless steel double doors parted to allow him entrance. The cool glow of the fluorescent bulbs flickered for a mere instant, and then steadied. Thomas entered the elevator and pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator began its smooth descent until a light squeal caught Thomas's ear. The sound became more pronounced and took on a grinding tone. Thomas scanned the ceiling of the aluminum tomb. The elevator started to vibrate and jerk. The sudden realization that he was suspended 29 floors above the ground in a box sent his heart into a quick jog. There are emergency brakes and backups, he thought. I'll be fine, just perhaps stuck for an hour or two. The elevator made a large jolt as it free-fell momentarily, then jerked to a stop. Thomas's heart was in a full-blown sprint now, hands wrapped so tightly around the railings it made them ache. Struggling to regain control of his breath and his wandering mind, Thomas slowly moved from the far corner towards the emergency button near the doors. The elevator moaned and creaked under the shifting weight of each slow step. As he reached the middle, the tracks moaned louder, and Thomas paused, his breath more controlled now, but his jugular was proof that his heart wasn't slowing down for anything. A calmness and silence took hold of everything. Thomas seized this moment and took one more step and pressed the emergency button with a slight panic. For a second, nothing happened. Suddenly, the alarm screamed, blocking out all other sounds. After what seemed like an eternity of the electronic howling, a voice crackled through the speaker on the wall. "Elevator 1? Are you in trouble? What seems to be the emergency?" A light feminine voice metallically tweaked through the speaker. "Hello, this is Thomas Burkhoff and I'm stuck in here." Cracking a nervous smile, he was relieved that he had reached someone. "Sir, it's going to be..." The voice over the speaker began to crack and fade. "No! Wait! You're breaking up!" Thomas said in a higher voice than he knew he had. A piercing sound like amplifier feedback shot out of the speaker. "Don't worry, Thomas, I have everything well in hand," came a deep, gravelly voice. "I'll do my best to keep you comfortable down here." The voice sneered with a hollow, sinister laugh that echoed from everywhere. Thomas's eyes shot around, looking for the source of the laughter. His stomach jumped into his throat before he could comprehend what happened. The sound of the metallic cable snapping pierced the silence like a gunshot. Thomas's heart seized, and the elevator plummeted into the dark. Chapter 2: Circle of Fire. Thomas awoke not to the sight of crumpled metal, electric sparks, or even pain. There was just nothingness. A blackness that seemed to have darker shades of black the harder he tried to look into it. "Welcome, Thomas." A strong, rasping voice came from directly behind him. Spinning quickly, he found a mirror image of himself. A striking man of 45. Strong jawline with olive skin and freshly shaven face. Icy blue eyes that would rival the clearest blue sky. Dark brown hair that bordered on black. Impeccably maintained. and dressed to exude power. "Who are you? I know you're not me," Thomas croaked. "Oh, but I am." Oh, I am you. The dark in you. There is so much dark in you, too. Buttoning his suit jacket, trying to regain the calm, cool control that allowed him to thrive and close massive deals, Thomas breathed deeply. "I asked you a question. Who are you?" he said, the confidence returning to his voice. "Oh, over the millennia, I've been given so many names. Lucifer? The devil? Ugh, Satan. Beelzebub? Shall I keep going?" "The devil? Really?" Thomas's voice oozed condescension. "Oh, that's quite okay. You don't need to believe. We're here to discuss you anyways," Lucifer said, buttoning his coat as well. "Shall we get on with it then?" "Let's get this over with. I'm a very busy man." Instantly, the footing beneath Thomas dissolved. As he plummeted down, the acrid smell of rotten eggs filled his nostrils. The darkness began to illuminate with a faint glow. Then, all at once, they were standing on a rocky cliff surrounded by flames leaping 50 stories in the air. Waves of wailing bombarded him, the sound of agony continually crashing against his eardrums. The heat in the air was stifling and burned with every inhalation. Thomas looked back at the mirror image of himself and saw the glossy blackness spread across Lucifer's eyes. "Welcome again to my... I'm sorry. Our home," Lucifer stated with a sneer. I don't belong down here with you, you monster!" Thomas lashed out. "No, of course you don't belong here. This is only the first level of hell. You belong much further below. This place is reserved for those with petty crimes. The entry level to hell, one might say." Lucifer's gravelly voice began to take on a metallic tinge. "I have much more planned for you." "Why the fuck do I belong down here? I've given money to charities, helped build orphanages, donated food shelters. I'm a philanthropist, damn it!" Thomas retorted, choking on the heavy air and smoke. "Didn't you receive tax credits for each of those acts? You didn't actually give anything that wasn't made back during tax season, and you know it," Lucifer smirked. "Of course I did, but that's what makes it a win-win. The destitute get the money they need to help them, and I don't technically lose any money. How is that worth all this?" Thomas's eyes opened wide, searching for the answer. "It's not. Tell me, Thomas, with a number of souls damned to this place, do you think I greet each one personally?" The question hung in the air while Thomas thought. "Let me help you out." "No!" "I don't. You are a special case, Thomas, and the number of souls you sent me and will be sending me in the future deserves a reward. You've been one of my best agents. Depending on how our meeting goes, I may reward you with 100 years out of every millennium free of torture during your eternal stay when all is said and done," Lucifer said coolly and plunged his hands into his pant pockets. 250 years seemed like a more appropriate reward if I am in fact that valuable, barked Thomas, ever the businessman. 125 years. And I suggest you take that because there will not be an alternative offer. Lucifer's gaze never left Thomas's eyes. Before I agree to any sort of deal, what proof is there that I belong here with the rabble of humanity? A wicked grin fell over Lucifer's face. This is the part I love the most. Shattering the illusions you humans have of your perfect lives. Suddenly, the two were walking on a rocky path in another part of hell amidst a cacophony of agony so thick it was almost tangible. Seeing the torment in one man's eyes, Thomas tried to avert his gaze. Take this monster that once walked the streets of Russia preying on the weak. This here is Andrei Chikatilo. He was known as the Butcher of Rostov. Andrei was a serial killer in Russia, preying on women and children. In his relatively short time on Earth, he brought terror, torment, and death to 56 poor souls. He was only convicted of 52. Andrei was strapped down to a stone table on his stomach. Thomas's mouth gaped as he witnessed the flesh being filleted from his back in long strips. It was like seeing the skin of an apple removed in a bright red ribbon. Except this apple screamed. Just when the demon ran out of strips of flesh, the table turned red hot, scorching his front. While the front of him burned, the skin on his back grew back almost instantly. Then, the process started all over again. Thomas turned and vomited off the edge of the path into a river of lava 10 feet below. Staggering back to his feet and using his pocket square to wipe his mouth, he walked on. Lucifer just smiled and strode forward. Now, where should we begin? Like most children, you had your arguments and schoolyard brawls, but those don't concern me. Your dad always expected top marks from you. There was no settling for second best. What's wrong with that? I don't see the harm in a man wanting his child to excel in life and make something of himself. Thomas's voice fell flat as his eyes scanned the surrounding suffering. Seeing the torment in one man's eyes, Thomas tried to avert his gaze. Your dad would lash you with a belt when things weren't done to his satisfaction, correct? Lucifer probed, already knowing the answer. My father instilled discipline in me and taught me that actions had consequences, Thomas retorted defensively. Ah, I see. Simply educating you in the ways of the world, Lucifer questioned. Of course! My dad was just trying to prepare me. Wait, did I just say dad? What am I, 10 years old? Thomas did not like feeling like he was losing control. Is this what it's like for people talking to me every day? Lucifer just walked, a smug look painted on his face. Did your dad feel as if your mother hadn't learned that lesson as a child? Thomas knew Lucifer had used dad on purpose to highlight Thomas's insecurity. Thomas had used that very tactic countless times on members of the board he wanted to undermine. Thomas was missing the point of the question, though. Distracted like a child again, focused on the item meant to anger him. What are you talking about? Thomas looked with caution at Lucifer. Thomas heard a scream increasing in volume until it felt like the audible anguish was going to plow into him. Instead, there was a huge splat that hit the lava river beside them. The two looked up and saw the forms of men and women falling from the sky in balls of blue-orange fire, each comet producing its own resonance of suffering. The combined measure created a harmony of horror. Some careened into the sides of mountains, some into more lava lakes, and some into other souls, already in the middle of torture, like Andrei. I call these little soul storms unfortunate showers, sneered Lucifer. At first, Thomas missed the pun, and then it hit him. Unfortunate being a synonym for damned. He knew the devil wasn't supposed to be nice, but man, what an asshole. All around them, ethereal bodies blew apart in high-speed collisions. There were parts of arms, legs, intestines. Thomas saw more than one eyeball separated from its socket, frantically looking around as it lay on the ground. Thomas had never experienced the kind of fracturing that was now taking place in his mind. Her mother wore a lot of modest clothes, right? High necklines, long sleeves, pants, or long skirts. Dresses that were full length with long sleeve cover-ups? Lucifer inquired in a leading manner. What does my mother's clothing have to do Before he could finish the sentence, Thomas realized what Lucifer meant. When his father left a mark on him that could be visible to someone at school, Thomas had to wear clothes that would conceal it. A lead brick dropped into his stomach. My dad hit my mom. Seeing the surprise in his face, Lucifer couldn't contain his fang-toothed grin. That's bullshit! Exclaimed Thomas. But he knew that wasn't true. His father had been an abusive husband, his mother a battered wife, and Thomas could never deny it again. Did you know they're both down here? Lucifer probed. I understand why my father would be, but why the fuck would my mom be down here? He had removed the personal title of dad, but doubled down on the swell of emotions by saying, Mom. That quickly, Thomas thought. Just like that, I can emotionally alienate my father. Screw it, the bastard deserves it, was his next thought. Lucifer's gaze hung on Thomas as he leaned against an obsidian pillar. The pillar was carved in the form of a cowardly-looking man being crushed while holding up a large bowl that contained a naked woman with sheer ecstasy in her features. Men being crushed by lust or desires. Your mom killed your father in an act of premeditated and cold-blooded murder. For that act, she's been sent here. My mother isn't some criminal mastermind. How could she have killed my father and gotten away with it? Sucks, Lucifer replied, his smile gleaming. But I know it sucks, but tell me, damn it! Thomas roared. You misunderstand me. Sucks. It's a paralytic medication usually used to relax tense muscles during surgery. The full name is succinylcholine, or SUCS for short. The beauty of SUCS as a murder weapon is it leaves barely any trace in a toxicology report. A clinical dose would have killed your father in 5 to 10 minutes, but it could have just left him brain dead. Your mom made sure it went past the clinical dosage. The explanation from Lucifer bore almost no inflection. It was like he was describing people walking across the street in Manhattan. Wouldn't the drug make it look like my father overdosed? Thomas questioned. That would raise suspicion since my father didn't have any other drugs around the house. True. You would think SUCS produces some telltale sign. But it doesn't. Your father spent the last moments of his life looking up at the woman he had beaten into submission. Paralyzed. He felt the chilling sensation of losing the use of his fingers, then arms, then legs, then head and neck. Slowly, he felt the paralytic start to seize control of his lungs, straining with every bit of his mind to draw breath in and out, knowing that it wasn't working. Looking at the needle in your mother's hand and laboring with all the force he could muster to scream out, yet not making so much as a peep. Your father drowned in a room full of air. Lucifer paused to allow his words to sink in. How did she get it? Thomas squeaked out. A pharmacy tech that was a battered woman as well. The tech noticed a bruise on your mother's back when she dropped her driver's license on the floor. Her shirt pulled up and exposed the bruise for a split second. The tech took her to a small exam room next to the pharmacy and was able to finally coax it out of her. She grabbed the vial out of a box that had been delivered to the pharmacy by mistake. The tech told her the inventory was always off a little, and no one would raise an eyebrow. The tech explained how much she would need to use to get the job done, and to make sure she discarded it well, and then left the room. A confident look rested on Lucifer's face as he concluded the tale. Tears streamed down Thomas's cheeks but evaporated before they even hit the ground. I never knew my mother had been abused. Lips and voice quivering as he spoke. A deep red rage filled Thomas suddenly. Why in the fuck do you have her down here to spend an eternity being tormented when her life is already full of torment? Hey, don't blame me, he shrugged nonchalantly. Blame the ever-merciful God you mortals love to pin your hopes on. She broke his rule, and despite the good reason she had to erase your father from the planet, he punished her for it. Thomas could feel the rage building behind his eyes. He grabbed Lucifer by the suit and was already in motion to punch him when Lucifer's eyes became pits of smoldering, pitch-black fire.
How dare you!
The voice resounded from every direction in an inhuman tone. Thomas crumbled to the floor, instantly remembering who was in front of him, and just where he was again. The crackling, flaming eye sockets cooled and returned to the glossy, pitch-black orbs they had been. Now where were we? Lucifer said merrily, as if the whole thing hadn't happened. Slowly, Thomas returned to his feet and dusted himself off. My parents, said Thomas, voice trembling. Ah, yes. Enough about them, though. You know their fate. But what about your life's deeds that have earned you your place down here? I think it's time for a change of scenery before we start on your life, though. Lucifer snapped his finger, and with a brilliant and violent flash, they were gone. Chapter 3. Circle of Gluttony. Thomas heard the growls, so much yelling that he was terrified to open his eyes. Slowly, one eye cracked to let in a sliver of his surroundings. Lucifer and Thomas were standing on a stone cliff that was perched about 30 feet above a vast dirt and rock plain. At regular intervals stood mountains of food inside cages. Crowds were gathered around every possible inch of the ground, reaching through the iron bars for any scrap of food they could grab. The food sat mere inches out of reach. From beneath the cliff, Thomas heard what sounded like large doors creaking their way open. From out of the doors came thousands, no, millions of small babies. Something appeared off, though. Thomas opened his eyes fully and saw the babies had small horns protruding from their heads and tails of varying shades from bright red to the darkest crimson. These babies were demon children. The huddled masses were so fixated on the food that they didn't notice the flurry of activity behind them until teeth started sinking into their flesh. A torrent of screams rose up in the vast cavern and moved across the plain in a wave as the demon spawns reached the souls farther away. Looking out over the waves of carnage, a cold sweat formed on Thomas's head. His legs turned into wet noodles instead of bones and muscles. The gnashing of teeth and wailing had to stop. Welcome to gluttony, Lucifer said with a flourish, where the souls of those who gorged themselves in life become the very thing they pursued with such passion and conviction in death. Food. The gluttonous feed the young demons of hell, help them grow big and strong, so that one day I can send them above. Lucifer stood surveying the carnage and beamed proudly. This is disgusting, Thomas said, fighting a rising urge to vomit. Turning his back on the demonic banquet, Thomas steeled his nerves. Why are we here, Lucifer? Because you are a glutton, Tom. You don't mind if I call you Tom, right? How am I a glutton? Thomas asked, chuckling and looking at his toned body. True, you're not a glutton of food. You are, however, a glutton of power and sadness. You enjoy imposing your will upon people and feasting on their sadness when they leave dissatisfied. Let's talk about your childhood and your brother, Lucifer said as he paced to the edge of the cliff, looking down. No, don't go there. Lucifer! Day after day, you would convince your little brother to do what you wanted to do. He would play the games you wanted to play by the rules you set. Say, What kind of fun things were there to do in the Steel City? Lucifer, don't.
Don't what?
Lucifer cut Thomas off. What do you think you're here for, Thomas? A stroll down happy memory lane? Or look at all the positive things you've done with your life? You're in hell. For a CEO, you're a pretty slow learner. The low flames building in Lucifer's eyes began to cool again. Now, as I was saying, you grew up in Pittsburgh. And when kids get bored, they tend to do dumb things. Don't worry. That's not just a Pittsburgh thing, that's an everywhere thing. Lucifer chuckled. So, do you remember the morning of Johnny's 10th birthday? You told him, as a rite of passage, he had to sneak onto a train and off without being caught? Thomas covered his ears and paced back and forth, muttering curses, trying to drown out Lucifer's voice. Do you really think covering your ears will help you? I can talk straight into your mind in this place, Thomas. Your brother did exactly what you asked of him. He snuck aboard an empty train. You and your friends stood a couple of tracks away, mocking him for choosing an empty train. As he got to the ladder to get down, the engineer came out of nowhere. Thomas pinched his eyes closed, but the memory played back on the back of his eyelids like a movie screen. Hey, get back here, you hoodlum! The engineer barked. The engineer reached for Johnny's hand to pull him back up. In a panic, Johnny let go of the ladder and pushed himself away from the train. Minutes seemed to pass as he fell. Johnny came crashing down and cracked the back of his head on the steel rail of the track. Your friends ran towards him and you ran away. Like a coward. Thomas wept on his knees. I was running to get my parents. Thomas choked out between sobs. Bullshit! You and I both know that's complete and utter bullshit. You ran and hid behind an abandoned building. Not at the loss of your brother, but because you told him to do something, and he did it. You had the power to convince someone to do something and they obeyed you. Yeah, you eventually got to your feet and had someone call 911. You were grounded for a month and spanked with a belt, but the rush you felt had never left you. Now you just assume people have no choice but to listen to you. Thomas sprang up from the ground and closed the distance between them with speed unknown to him. Anger, rage, and guilt drove him forward. With one tremendous push, Thomas freed Lucifer from his spot on the cliff and sent him falling into the valley of teeth and blood. Lucifer screamed as he fell and hit the ground in a cloud of dust. Thomas looked for signs of Lucifer's body but saw nothing. With a crack of thunder, Lucifer appeared behind Thomas. Whirling around to defend himself, Thomas reached to grab Lucifer by the jacket, but Lucifer already had a hand around Thomas's throat. Thick, gnarled nails extended from Lucifer's now crimson-red hand. Thomas got a small glimpse of what Lucifer's real form looked like in the demonic hand. Thomas, I am trying, but you are really testing my patience, Lucifer said as he walked Thomas to the edge of the cliff. Lucifer stood at the edge as Thomas's full body weight hung from Lucifer's clutch. He clawed at Lucifer's arm and whimpered for his life. Lucifer's face contorted, sprouting two large curved horns. His eyes pits of black fire in strong chiseled features.
I could cast you down and let the younglings devour you. Find new and creative ways to torment your soul.
That's not why I brought you here, though. Lucifer stepped off the cliff, lowering them both down to the floor below. As punishment for your actions, you will have 3 bites taken from you. Thomas fought to free himself. Lucifer's clutch in his throat was unwavering. Picking 3 demonic toddlers at random, Lucifer called them over. Now each of you gets 1 bite. That's it, Lucifer informed them in a fatherly tone. The first satanic spawn bit down on Thomas's forearm, taking clothing and flesh without discrimination. Thomas shrieked as muscle was ripped from bone. Blood oozed from every severed blood vessel in the bite. Thomas strained to keep his mind from shredding with the pain. The second vile-looking gremlin had blood dripping from its mouth with scratches all over from fighting over the souls they had torn apart. The gremlin sprung to his arm like a perch and bit into the side of his neck, shaking his head as he ripped a crescent of flesh from Thomas and leapt back to the ground, chewing. The hellion had missed his jugular on purpose. Lightning shot through his body with the second bite, and Thomas felt as though he was going to pass out. Lucifer slapped his face firmly to keep Thomas awake. The last one barely waited for the second wicked creature to clear before it leapt to the right calf muscle. Stretching its jaw as wide as possible, half of Thomas's calf had now been volunteered as a snack. With so much pain already bombarding his body, Thomas's brain barely registered the bite. His body fell limp in Lucifer's hand and crumpled to the floor as his throat was freed from the demonic grip. Everything went black. Chapter 4: Circle of Treachery. Thomas slowly awoke to his body's uncontrolled shivering and snow crystals stinging his face. He quickly glanced down at his arm and calf while simultaneously reaching for his neck. The wounds were gone, but a sharp tinge of pain remained in each spot. Had Lucifer tired of him and left him to freeze to death? Thomas scoffed at that thought. How can you die again if you're already dead? Flashes of the tortures he had seen and felt here proved you could. Over and over again, you could and would die. Forever. Thomas heard something like the hiss of water hitting a scalding hot pan, only to see the devil standing behind him. Feeling better after our beauty rest, are we, Thomas? Whipping his head around, Thomas saw Lucifer standing there with all the snow in a 5-foot radius melted around him. Despite the fear he felt, Thomas rushed over to gain some warmth from Lucifer. Where are we? Why is it so cold here? Thomas asked through chattering teeth. This? This is the Circle of Treachery, and it is the very lowest level of hell, Lucifer said with a grim look. What's the matter, Lucifer? You don't seem to delight in this circle as much as the others, Thomas said with a smirk. Watch it. I can go back to letting you freeze if you prefer. Thomas just shook his head, casting his eyes downward. I despise this circle because it is the circle I am condemned to by my creator. I disagreed with his opinion, which started a fight, then a war, Lucifer said as he began to walk up a snow-covered ridge. Thomas stuck close to Lucifer, trying to keep his soul from freezing. That doesn't explain the cold, though, Lucifer. Thomas threw the verbal jab out. Lucifer clenched his teeth, so the punch landed. This place is a frozen wasteland for 2 reasons. First, it keeps my physical form sealed in ice. The second is because the souls that come here betray people without any caring or warmth in their hearts. They actually make this place colder. The snow liquefied and evaporated in front of Lucifer with each step he took. Meanwhile, the wind howled around them. Snow blew across the vast expanse with strange-looking trees dotting the landscape. Thomas couldn't make out why they looked strange, only that he had never seen them before. As they were approaching the crest of the ridge, Thomas could hear voices on the wind. Unable to make them out, either because of the distance or the sheer number of people, Thomas strained to hear any of them individually. As they crested the hill, Thomas saw a mass of humanity all gathered around a perfectly circular chasm. The chasm had a large island in the middle with a roaring fire. Planks stretched horizontally across the chasm. People were at various stages of crossing the planks when the masses would turn the planks on their side and drop those crossing into the pit below. Thomas spotted 3 people working as a team. 2 were fending off several others attempting to reach the makeshift bridge. Just before making it across, the individual transversing the plank was thrown off by his protectors. They lifted the board, causing him to lose his footing and fall into the pit. One of the protectors seized the opportunity to push the other into the pit, but was pulled in by the falling protector. They both fell into the dark and let out horrific screams seconds later. They could all be warm if they worked together to cross, but they're all traitors and turn on each other as soon as they're given the chance, Lucifer said, his calm and confidence both back in place. What's in the bottom of the pit? What's with these weird-looking trees? Thomas questioned warily. The bottom of the pit is filled with thousands and thousands of razor-sharp stalagmites of ice. The trees are twisted monuments of treachery. Groups of people trying to reach the fires from further out on the ice lake. They all trying to rob each other of body heat and use each other as shelter from the driving winds. As a result, their bodies were frozen together in unnatural patterns which, oddly enough, emulate nature. Lucifer gave a chuckle and a shrug as he said it, hands sunk in his pants pockets. Why are we down in this circle, Lucifer? Lucifer turned to Thomas, head cocked to the side like a dog. Surely you're joking, right? What about the numerous women you've betrayed by claiming they were the only one, or the wife you haven't been faithful to in years? Defensively, Thomas lashed back. Hey, I am 100% sure my wife is cheating on me as well. Plus, all the other girls were just during dating. I only told them the things they wanted to hear to keep them around until I was done with them. They weren't serious about me like I wasn't about them. Those relationships with that of a couple of teenagers having fun. Thomas laughed it off. Everyone does that when they're young. Lucifer's mouth twisted into a knowing smirk. 3 of your ex-girlfriends were so in love with you that they committed suicide after you dumped them. Does that sound like kids that weren't serious? Or having fun? It was a punch that knocked the breath out of Thomas. Lucifer let the aching silence stretch on for a minute. That's 3 souls you have placed in my care. However, that's not all. Thomas's eyes flashed at Lucifer, half angered and half terrified to hear more. You look at me as if you haven't lived the life yourself. You've seen the movie. You already know what's coming. With a blinding light and the smell of sulfur that accompanies a match being lit, they were transported again. They stood before a man whose feet were frozen in place and had just had a searing hot bucket of water poured over them. Any ice that clung to his skin was promptly melted and flesh almost glowed red from the burns. 6 demons began pummeling him, each wielding a different weapon fashioned from ice. A sledgehammer, a mace, a whip, a scythe, a chain, and a samurai sword, each leaving their own unique mark of pain on his flesh. What in the hell are we looking at? Thomas groaned, feeling queasy. Oh, you mean who, don't you? Lucifer cocked an eyebrow up. Thomas turned and gave a look of, are you serious? This is H.H. Holmes. He created a murder mystery mansion in Chicago, Illinois during the time of the World's Fair. He lured helpless, innocent women with the promise of employment during the event. They were each tormented or tortured in varying rooms of the house and were eventually murdered. Betraying the trust of others for his own devious pleasures landed him in this place. Now he is made to feel the cold sting of betrayers' commonly used tools. Lucifer gestured with a sweeping palm-up motion. I fail to see how those weapons are tools of deceit, Thomas scoffed. The sledgehammer is a blunt but powerful betrayal. The mace represents a heavy betrayal that was barbed with the intent to inflict pain. The whip and chain are both meant to cause more acute betrayals, but the chain is one that lies are built link upon link. The sword represents betrayals that are meant to take pieces of you or kill the light inside you. Finally, the scythe is meant to sever you from your connection with people, places, or things. Lucifer grinned widely at the beauty of it. Thomas nodded as the man slowly refroze to start the process again. He could see how each was meant to inflict a certain kind of pain. Let's talk about your business partner, Andy Schultz. Thomas gave Lucifer a solemn look and began a well-rehearsed speech. It was a terrible tragedy. We had warned him about drinking on the roof and that he could fall. His poor parents and fiancé, the loss they must have felt. Unbearable. Thomas bowed his head. A slow clap began. Bravo. Just incredible. You know, that almost looked and sounded sincere. Seriously, Thomas, you are a professional. Thomas looked up, deflated. Now, let's discuss what really happened. You met Andy Schultz in an intro to business class in your first year at Stanford. You thought he was a bit quirky, but you guys became fast friends. The two of you swore that you would help each other to not only pass, but that you would be valedictorian and salutatorian. Incredibly, you were, for your associates, bachelor's, and master's degrees. You both applied to Manhattan Dynamics and took upper mid-level positions as a reward for your hard work. If all this wasn't impressive enough, you both buckled down even harder and put in some grueling nights. 36-hour shifts. I gotta tell you, Thomas, if you had focused your efforts toward cancer research or some, noble cause, you could have done some real good in the world. Not that it makes a difference now. Thomas looked irked and over it. Can we just skip to the end, Lucifer? Oh, no, we can't do that. The best part is just around the corner. Pure joy painted across Lucifer's face. Your teamwork rewarded you guys yet again by moving up the ranks very quickly. You managed to do it the fastest in the company history, as a matter of fact. The problem was, Andy was starting to drift a little. You noticed he didn't want to stay late into the night as often, coming up with excuses for why he needed to leave. Doing your research, you found out he met a girl and was quite smitten. Andy's work began to slack, and you were picking up more of his responsibilities to help. He became jealous of his relationship and his beautiful girlfriend. You became jealous that he had a life outside of work. Your goals, your priorities were no longer at the top of his priority list. After a couple of years of hard work, you finally made it onto the board of directors. Do you remember who wasn't there to congratulate you? Lucifer probed, inquiring. Of course I remember, Thomas hissed. Andy. Lucifer nodded. Do you remember what was so important that he wasn't there for you on your big day? Thomas shot Lucifer a glare. The asshole was getting engaged. Can you believe it? After all of our hard work to make it to the top, he was willing to throw it away for a woman. Lucifer grinned from ear to ear. This next part is my favorite. The beauty behind it just fills me with joy. You called him in a calm voice, told him about your promotion, and said he should come up to your new office on the 33rd floor for a mandatory celebration drink. He came straight to your office, embraced you, and sincerely congratulated you. And he excitedly revealed the reason for his absence the day before, and that it was cause for celebration as well. Forcing a smile and feigning happiness for Andy, you led him to the rooftop. Finally, after getting him good and drunk, Andy stood at the edge of the rooftop looking out over the city. You shoved your best friend from the rooftop, watched him fall to the concrete waiting below before removing your prints from the glass and bottle of liquor and setting them on the ledge.
You're damn right I did,
Thomas cut in, his voice wild and full of rage. I got his fiancée to fall in love with me, marry me, and give me a son. Again, Lucifer clapped. You killed your best friend, stole his woman, and produced a son to carry on your name. Serves the asshole right for kicking me to the curb like he did. I would gladly do it again, Thomas said in a strangled voice that was growing hoarse from the strain. There was a long pause, the tension so thick it was almost a physical obstruction between them. Watching more savage and selfish souls condemning one another to pain and misery, Lucifer wore a grin, looking at Thomas out of his peripheral view. Thomas, how much do you love your son? With a quick flash, they vanished from the frozen wasteland. Chapter 5, Circle of Fire Revisited. Plumes of smoke billowed forth as they made their re-entry to the fire-laden prison. It was a jarring transition. Thomas wondered if this was how frozen dinners felt. Being near Lucifer in the circle of treachery, his body could still feel and had absorbed some of the bitter cold there. Then he remembered. No, not my body. My soul. The bodily form is just for show. Every inch of me in this place is my soul. And right now my soul feels like I'm standing in the middle of a huge campfire. Yoo-hoo! Hail to Thomas! Lucifer interrupted Thomas's train of thought. With flaming souls falling all around them, they stood looking over a lake of fire. The wailing and howling of souls in agony was present all around, but Thomas found that it was becoming white noise to him.
Thomas!
A desperate scream came from somewhere behind the pair. Thomas spun around to see Dave Jorgensen, a former employee of Manhattan Dynamics. Hey, Dave. I didn't know you were dead. Can't say I'm surprised to see you here, though. Dave stood between two high rock walls with his hands shackled and arms spread wide. The iron shackles hanging from the walls did not allow much slack in them, making the outstretched arms hang awkwardly. Thomas followed the tormented figure down to see that his balls were literally in a vice. Nausea rose up quickly in Thomas's stomach. The screw turned with a slow squeak, while the two plates neared each other. What the hell did you do to be tormented like this? Thomas asked in disbelief. The vice was growing ever tighter, and cries of agony leapt from Dave's throat. He was a very resentful and jealous man, Lucifer started. He always took more than his share, questioning anyone getting more than he received, and bold-faced lying about others when all else failed. Out of anger, he followed a co-worker home one night and beat him badly. He tied the co-worker's wife up and proceeded to rape her in full view of her husband. Battered, bruised, and feeling more violated than ever in her life, she wished this punishment upon him when he died. Thomas turned back to see Dave's penis removed with scissors and his eyes burned out with red-hot iron pokers, right at the very moment the vice crushed his balls. Oh, as fucked up as this torture is, you deserve every bit of it. I hope you rot down here. Thomas spit at him and then turned away. Lucifer grinned and clapped a hand to his shoulder. How much do you love your son? I asked. Lucifer raised an eyebrow. Thomas flushed red and realized much too late that his face had already betrayed his thoughts. Lucifer, my son is off limits. You can't have him as part of any deal. Thomas barked as spittle flew. Lucifer's grin was ear to ear again. Don't you understand? You've already delivered him to me. All the things you tried teaching him about how to manipulate people to gain the best possible advantage for himself. All the lessons on how to make your feelings look convincing. He's shaping up to be a better prospect of delivering souls to me than you. Lashing out, Thomas's voice took on a threatening tone.
You stay the hell away from my son!
Lucifer's laugh came from deep down in his gut. Was that not supposed to be a hell pun? Oh, the fact of the matter is that I can sit back and watch him leave scars that drive people to me and wait for him to arrive. Pure panic had overcome Thomas. His eyes darted around as though there was a solution before him that he just wasn't seeing. Lucifer buttoned the jacket on the hand-tailored suit and began walking away. You weren't totally behaved during our time together, trying to throw me off a cliff in my own home and all. So, the terms of our earlier negotiations have been altered. You will get a reprieve of 80 years out of every millennium of suffering, instead of 125 years as we previously agreed. I'll send you video clips of the deeds your son does that send other souls to join us. Whether it's corrupting individuals, committing adultery, theft, or hundreds of other sins, you'll bear witness to them all. I will, as a special treat, give you a glimpse of the torture he earns with each one. Should be a fun way to spend eternity, don't you think? I'll continue the process with all of your descendants. Undoubtedly, you'll feel less and less attached to them over time, but you will still know they are some extension of your bloodline. The terrifying details of everything Lucifer promised poured into Thomas's head faster than he could process. The light of his world that once fit in the crook of his arm. The infant who had stumbled and scraped his knee, crying out for his daddy when learning to walk. Comforting the young boy when he struck out in the Little League Championship, losing the game for his team. Thomas had not realized how quickly the years had gone. His son was a young man now, on the verge of being out in the world on his own. He had not realized until this moment what his son meant to him. As Lucifer stood laughing about the demise and torture of his son, Thomas's heart felt like it shattered into a million pieces, and each of those splintered into a million more. I can't wait for your son to join us, Lucifer said, chuckling.
Wait!
Thomas saw Lucifer snap his fingers. Then nothing. Chapter 6. The Doors. Thomas stood locking his eyelids down against the vision of horrors that surely awaited him. For the first time in what seemed an eternity, it was silent all around him. Apprehensive of his surroundings, Thomas slowly released the locks on his eyelids to peer at his fate. He stood before an elevator in his office, the down arrow lit in red on a digital board above the open doorway. Thomas stood in disbelief. Had everything been a nightmare? His inner self creating the layers of hell to spark a change before his fate was permanent? He barely had time to ponder the thought before the wounds of the bite stung sharp and fresh. No. It had been real. Every miserable second of it. A whisper caressed his ear. If you enter the elevator, you will join me forever. However, your son will change his ways and live a happy, normal life. Or you can take the stairwell to your right and save yourself. But everything I have said will come to pass. The now familiar hiss of Lucifer's voice left him to ponder. Thomas calmly turned around, walked over to his office, and poured himself a scotch on the rocks. The Johnny Walker Blue slid down his throat, giving the familiar warmth in his chest of high-quality scotch. Thomas stood looking out over the city, wondering why it had taken so long for him to figure out the truth. The truth was that he was an asshole and a murderer. He had always told himself the lies and had even got to the point of believing them. His son's life and future eternal road now rested upon his decision. Why have I been such a bastard? Thomas questioned the empty room, sipping his scotch, mind cycling through some of the horrible events of his life that Lucifer hadn't brought to light, exposing an affair that one of the board members was having with his secretary so he could move up the chain. God, how long would it be before someone did the same to him? He deserved that, and so much more. He deserved to be pushed off the roof. So many lives, so many souls had been ruined or corrupted by him. Now, it was finally going to come to an end. Or would it? Would he really be able to be that selfless? His whole life was an exercise in self-advancement. Finishing his scotch, Thomas strolled back to the bar and poured himself another drink. Suddenly, an omnipresent voice boomed. If you're going to sit here and waste my time, then I shall make the decision for you and remove the hope of any rewards. Lucifer's voice was flat, but unrest was growing. Just one more drink, please. You waited this long for my choice. Try not to let the suspense kill me, Thomas said with his arrogant boss tone.
You have 5 minutes to pick a way down. Otherwise, your son dies tonight and is mine forever!
A haunting laugh echoed into nothing. Panic washed over Thomas's face. He didn't even feel the highball glass slip from his hand and shatter on the floor. He shook his head, regaining his composure, or so he thought. Thomas reached for another crystal highball glass and dropped a couple of ice cubes in it. As he brought the neck of the decanter to the glass, they chattered off each other with light clinking. Thomas tried to steady his shaking hands, but it was useless. If he simply sat and did nothing, his son would die. But he would live. It completely removed the need for him to make a choice. If I just do nothing, then the responsibility isn't mine to bear, he thought. He knew that was simple and childish. Action through inaction is rarely the hallmark of a great man, he thought. He looked down at the chair opposite him, at his massive redwood desk. He remembered his 13-year-old son sitting there while Thomas chewed someone's ass out about poor quarterly numbers. The young prince, as his dad referred to him, had questions about how to handle a bully. Slamming the phone, Thomas turned to his son and immediately started his lesson. First, son, you find out what this kid's vulnerabilities are, then his fears, and finally, you leverage both against him publicly. This should shame him so greatly he never wants to mess with you again. If he does, you can exploit his fears even further. Show him that you are willing to go to a far crazier place than he is, and you'll never be bothered by him or anyone else again. After that, be charismatic and accepting to people. They will understand you're not to be crossed, but are someone they want to befriend. Thomas sat back and crossed his legs and tented his interlocked fingers simultaneously. Just like that, his heir understood what he had to do. Thomas II stood to leave. As he opened the door, his father's voice halted him. Remember, son, information is the lifeblood of society. How detailed and accurate your information is will make all the difference. Make this bully pay, son. His son gave a nod and strolled to the elevator, pushed the button, and went down the elevator. The elevator, Thomas thought. 3 minutes. A gravelly voice barked. Thomas sat down in his Italian leather chair when the next memory forced its way in. Thomas awoke from sleeping on the couch in his living room, the baby monitor casting a soft glow in his face. Thomas sat up trying to blink and rub the blurred vision of his sleepy eyes away. After blinking a few more times, his vision crystallized, and immediate dread flooded his whole body. There was his son, lying face down in the crib, motionless. Before he was even aware of it, his feet had carried him over the side of the couch, and he leapt to the the third step of the staircase. His long stride was devouring huge sections of the staircase in a controlled sprint. At the top of the stairs, he took the half-right turn to the hallway of the nursery. If some distances seemed to stretch during times of stress, Thomas noticed this was the opposite. He was clearing huge sections of the house effortlessly. Thomas was aware that the only sound present was the rapid thudding of his own heart. The hospital video about SIDS and babies sleeping face down playing on a constant loop in his mind. Thomas burst through the door with crazed concern for his young son. Thomas got to the edge of the crib, only to find that the young prince was fine. The monitor had given the appearance that his face was straight down, but his head was cocked to the side slightly. Standing there in the sound of his son's low, rhythmic breathing. Looking down, Thomas realized just how much this little guy meant to him. He slipped out of the nursery and sobbed. 1 minute left. Lucifer's voice jolted Thomas back to his office. The announcement came much louder this time. A flurry of memories flew past Thomas's eyes. First, bike rides, Little League games, school plays, and a dizzying number of others. Leaning over his desk, tears flowed freely, sobbing again as he had the day he ran to the crib. For all the memories seen, how many have I missed being here in the office? The tears flowed like never before. How could I have taken that little baby and walked him to the gates of hell? I brought his soul an eternity of suffering and damnation. Choking on his emotions, snot, and tears, the pedestal of lies that held him high now crumbling. 30 seconds. Lucifer's voice assaulted Thomas. Fuck you, Lucifer! You can't have my son! Thomas's feet reached a full sprint, but brought him to the doorway of the stairwell. Standing before it, he weighed his life and so many thousands of lives in his hands. The future of his descendants rested on his next action. I can change my son if I get down from here, he thought. I'll move out of the city and never look back. The amusement of that simple thought made him smile. Tears streamed down Thomas's face. Even knowing all the horrible things I've done, I am still trying to save myself. Son of a bitch, I'm an asshole! Eyes bloodshot and face lined with tears, Thomas slammed the door. 5, 4, 3, 2. Thomas hurled himself into the elevator in a full sprint. Only moments after hitting the back wall, the door slammed shut. It began its descent. The cable snapped with the sound of a bullwhip, and the steel box plummeted until it hit the foundation. A crater was the final mark Thomas left on the world. Manhattan Dynamics conducted an investigation into the faulty elevator following the death of its CEO. Several building codes were found to be out of compliance. Thomas had been informed of the necessary upgrades that were going to be quite expensive. Not wanting to spend so much on the building, he found it was cheaper to pay off inspectors for false reports. He knew the elevators were out of code, yet he allowed everyone to ride them every day. People who worked for him and trusted that he was making the best choices for them. Mothers, fathers, young men and women, single and in love or lust. People at all different stages of their lives, with their own things they held dear, rode the elevators every day, never knowing how close they were to death. Employees of the company raised a class action suit for hazardous work conditions. Manhattan Dynamics paid out millions. Thomas's corruption and attempt to give Manhattan Dynamics a healthier bank account cost the company millions. Thomas paid with his life and his soul.
Chilling tales for dark nights.